tell you there's only one truth, but there's thousands of ways that you can reach that truth. But eventually, you get to the point that all of them converge to the same answer, and that is the way reality is. I was working on my PhD. I realized my mind had access to information that was unknown. That changed my whole life. Suddenly, there was this whole bigger piece of reality. It had nothing to do with the physical world. It was another whole set of reality that had to do with consciousness. As a scientist, I wanted to know, how did it work? At first, up until just a year and a half ago, I would have told you that I had a reality model, not necessarily the model. But after years and years and years, I realized that there wasn't any other answer. And the big breakthrough was that, what's the meaning of life? To become love, to grow. That's why you're here. So if you change your gears on life, your life gets better and better, because now you're in this virtual reality leveling up, and you'll find that you end up happy.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Know Thyself podcast. Our guest today is a former nuclear physicist who founded my big theory of everything. His big theory of everything is his theory that unifies philosophy, physics, and metaphysics, and it has immense implications on the meaning of life and how one might navigate their own life. As a reminder, as always, we have timestamps in the description that will kind of walk us through exploring the theory to the different applications and implications around how one might live life most effectively. But I encourage you to kind of go through this chronologically, as we're going to start by building the foundation of his theory and then going deeper and higher from there. Thomas Campbell, thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
You've been quite highly requested to come on this show, and it's a pleasure to have you here now in the physical. So thank you for making the trek out.
Well, thank you for your listeners wanting me to come talk to them. That's good. It's always nice to talk to a friendly audience.
Yeah. I think, for everybody that's tuning in, not everyone's super familiar with your theory. And I think it would be important just to start very baseline by asking, what is a theory of everything? And then maybe you can share why you felt compelled to create your own.
Well, a theory of everything is just exactly what it sounds like. It's a theory that explains everything. When I say explain, I mean it explains it as science would explain it. It gives a logical understanding of how everything works, why it works that way, and what are the interfaces? What are all the logical conclusions of the basic theory? And it will create a better physics. It explains things like quantum physics. Why should the reality be probability at the base, which is what quantum physics says? You get down to the small particles and you don't find mass. You don't find little tiny pieces of mass at all. Matter of fact, the physicists say at a CERN kind of atom smasher, they'll tell you that if they assumed that a particle like an electron was a little piece of mass with a charge, they wouldn't get the right answers. That's not what it is. They would tell you that the electron is a point with the attributes of charge and the attributes of mass. That is how you would describe an electron in a computer program. And that is what the reality is. It really is a computer program. So the physicists now have come to the realization that reality is information-based. And they've come to that conclusion, a decade, 2 decades ago for many of them. Now, that's not all physicists. That's the ones that are on the edge of quantum physics, really. The particle physicists and the quantum theorists, mostly. So if you dig down deep into our reality, you find information. Now, what does that mean? Well, when you say they have information, that means that it's computable, that reality is computable. An information system can create whatever information. It's a very general information system, can create any kind of information. So that means our reality is computable. If it's computable, then that means it can be rendered in a computer. And if you think about it, how else could it be rendered? There aren't any other contenders. It's not like, well, it could be rendered in a computer and there's nothing else there. So it leaves us with basically a virtual reality, that this reality that we call the physical universe is really a virtual reality, computed. Now, that's a real hard thing to wrap your mind around, and most people hearing that will go, wow, this guy's bonkers, that's impossible. It doesn't make any sense. But it does make sense. But it's a big, and the time before we're done, it will have made sense. But it's a huge paradigm shift. And I would say that it's the next big paradigm shift that will occur in science, in philosophy, in theology. It affects everything. And it's not just about science. If it were just about science, like the other big paradigm shifts, we're not at the center of the universe. Well, they believed that because they didn't understand that the Earth rotated on its axis. They saw the sun and the stars all come up and then set and then come up again and set. So it looked like the Earth was at the center and everything was going around us. It had to be in the center. How else would everything go around us? But the Earth turns on its axis, so that's how everything looks like it's going around us. And then the flat Earth versus the round Earth, that was another big paradigm shift. But those two paradigm shifts really only interested science types, philosophy types. It didn't interest a guy in the street. The guy's trying to make a living and survive and get his crops in and get them out in time and so on. He doesn't really care a whole lot about whether the Earth's flat or whether it's round or whether we're at the center of the universe or we're not. But this paradigm shift will affect everyone. Matter of fact, it not only will produce a new, more general, more accurate physics, but it also produces a logical, what do we call it, a logical map, a logical understanding of the subjective world as well as the objective world. And we've never had that before. That's new. And it talks about things that are important to that farmer that needs to get the crop in, about his life, about his existence, about what his purpose is, what he should be doing. How do you level up in this game? All of those things are important. They affect your relationships. They affect who you are and how you go about life, the choices you make. So this paradigm shift is one that affects everyone and affects everyone very much, greatly.
So you speak about this theory being inclusive of not just the objective world, which the materialist reductionists would be a proponent of focusing on, but also including the subjective world. And one cannot explore the subjective world without exploring the nature of consciousness. And I think to start baseline and build our way up through your theory and its implications, one cannot do that without exploring the perspective of what consciousness is in its fundamental aspect. So walk us through that notion, and then we can go from there.
Well, the fundamental, if you will, the fundamental understanding that you need to approach this theory of everything is that consciousness is fundamental. Everything else is a derivative of consciousness. Now, that idea used to be called, the
Panpsychist?
No, that's not the word I'm thinking of. There was the idealism. It was called idealism. Idealism is an idea that what's really real is not this physical world, but something behind this physical world. And Plato had his famous, allegory of the people in the cave, and all they could see were their shadows on the wall, and they thought that those shadows were reality. They didn't understand the light behind them casting the shadows. They didn't understand the bigger picture. So they believed that they were the shadows on the wall. Well, that's idealism. There's something else out there that's more fundamental than the physical world. And of course, the Buddha said the same thing. He said this reality is maya, it's illusion. And of course, It is. So that's true as well. But once you understand consciousness, then you can derive physics from consciousness. I can derive and have derived quantum physics and relativity both, which are the two big gems of physics. I can answer the paradoxes in both of those sciences that they can't answer. There's a lot of questions there, things they know are true, but they have no idea how or why that they're true. Like, why is the speed of light a constant? Why is probability at the base of reality? These are things that they don't know. What does it mean to say that the wave, the probability wave function collapses to a particle? Physicists they say things like that, and of course it doesn't make any sense. Probability is a mathematics. How does mathematics written on a piece of paper collapse to a physical particle? That's nonsense. Of course it doesn't happen, but it's a metaphor. And what it looks like is that happens. It looks like you have probability, and then suddenly you have a particle someplace that you measure. But it just looks like that. It isn't. There's a big difference between what is and what things look like. A very big difference. So consciousness is fundamental. And I have one assumption in my model, just one, and everything else is derived from that logically. And that assumption is that consciousness exists. That's it. That's the sum total of all of my assumptions, is that consciousness exists. And what I did was I started with the smallest piece of consciousness, like a consciousness cell, if you will, as an analogy to the life and the fauna and the people and everything that's on this planet starts with cells, right? Cells, the basic unit of life. So think of it as a reality cell or a consciousness cell. And I define consciousness as awareness with a choice. That's it. Very simple definition. It's awareness with a choice. But that definition carries a whole lot of things with it. It carries, the awareness that kind of comes in with the assumption of consciousness. That's what consciousness is, awareness. And as a choice. So if you have a choice, that means there was before the choice and after the choice. So time comes in as logically necessary. If you're making a choice, you have to make it based on something and for some purpose. So you get input, and now we get input through our five senses. And then we process that input, and we compare it to what we have in memory. So now we have processing, we have memory. Then we process it a little more, and we get an output. What are we going to do about that input? What does it mean to us? What is its significance? So what do you know that has input, processing, memory, and then output? That's an information system. So I model consciousness as an information system. And I look at all of the fundamental functions of consciousness, and I give them names. I made up names because I didn't want to use the old names because they were associated with this group or this religion or that. And rather than start those arguments, my God's smarter than your gods, I made up my own terms. So I start with the larger consciousness system. That's the whole system.
LCS.
LCS, right. And then I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but it breaks into parts, and those are individuated units of consciousness with partition off a smaller piece, which is a free will awareness unit. So I come up with these metaphors, really. You have to look at those as metaphors. Don't look at them as like physical objects. They're not objects. They're metaphors. It's understanding. Talking about consciousness is a very abstract conversation. Our language is only good for talking about things because it developed for us to communicate about things, each other being things, bodies, things in our environment, whatever. So our language is very material focused and doesn't really have the words and concepts to talk a lot about what's not physical. But yet consciousness is not physical. Consciousness is not created in a brain. Okay, so I'm skipping a lot of steps here, but we can go back and fill them in as you want to. So if you have the very smallest piece of consciousness, it's basically an awareness that can be aware of two things, A or B, 1 or 0. It's binary. Okay, that's the smallest set of things you're going to be aware of. If you're only aware of one thing, then you wouldn't be able to make a choice. You wouldn't have, that wouldn't work. If there's only one thing, then you're stuck. There's nothing you can do with that. So the smallest thing with a choice is two things. Now, this awareness can be in state 1 or state 2, a 1 or a 0. So it has memory. That's part of awareness. Awareness has memory. If it doesn't have memory, then everything it's aware of is the first thing it's ever been aware of, if there's no memory. So you can't build on that. If everything you're aware of is the first thing you've ever been aware of, then you can't build anything with it. There's nothing to build. You have to build the next thing based on what you had before. So you see, just that tiny concept of awareness with a choice has all kinds of logical consequences to it. Time, free will. You have to have free will because otherwise there's no choice without free will. If it's a forced choice, and it's not a free choice, it's not really a choice. It just happens. So you have free will, you have time, before and after, and you have consciousness. And all three of those are logically necessary for each other. Okay, so now we have consciousness as an information system, and it evolves. How does a conscious system, how does an information system evolve? And I'm going through kind of key steps that we're going to get there in a hurry, and then we can flesh it out later. So if you have an information system, and if that information system has all of its bits random, then there's no information in that system. By the definition of random, if all the bits in the system are random, there is no information. But if you take some of those bits and order them, make order out of those bits, so those 3 bits together, you stack one on top of the other. You make a little triangle out of them. You do something that orders them, and now you have information. And that information can be a symbol for something, could stand for something. It could be the number 4 or the letter Z. You have information. Now, what you've done is you've lowered the entropy of the system. Entropy is a measure of disorder. High entropy, lots of disorder. Low entropy, less disorder. So when you take all random bits and order some of them, you've lowered the entropy. You've created order. And from that, you can see that this little consciousness cell, if you will, that's just binary, it has memory. So it can remember that it was in a state A, and then a B, and then another B, and then an A, and an A, and a B, and an A, and it can start with its memory building patterns. And those patterns now are more order, lower entropy, and those patterns can stand for something too. And you may have this pattern and that pattern, and now you have 2 patterns. So, and then you have 4 patterns, and you can group those 4 patterns into 2 of 2. So you very quickly end up with mathematics out of, the patterns. It's kind of obvious. You just stumble into mathematics because it's about quantity. Mathematics is nothing more than the logic of quantity. And the reason math is so valuable to scientists who are studying the physical world is that the physical world is totally in terms of quantity. How much does it weigh? What volume does it have? What's it composed of? It's all about quantity. So math describes those things. It is the logic of quantity. That's what numbers are. Addition, subtraction, multiplication. All of it is just the logic of quantity. So math is really good at describing things that are based on quantity. And it's really poor at describing things that are based on quality. In the objective world, you have quantity. In the subjective world, you have quality. They're different things. So what happens in the subjective world? Math doesn't seem to apply to that. Well, it doesn't. When you have the objective world, you have an intellect that processes logic in that world. And when you are in the intuitive side that's processing the subjective side, that is just information comes in whole chunks. So our consciousness has two ways of processing information: the intellectual side, the logic, and the intuitive side. Beyond logic, you just get the information. Now, as it turns out, of course, in our culture, we really put high value on that intellect, and people earn rewards in the society based on how well they can use that intellect, how they can apply it. And our intuitive side is neglected almost entirely. Matter of fact, science will tell you that there is no such thing as an intuitive side. Intuition is all just bogus nonsense. You had that idea all along. You just didn't know. They kind of say that's not there. But this model also describes very clearly everything paranormal, why it happens, what the mechanism is, and everything paranormal happens on the intuitive side. Nothing paranormal ever happens on the intellectual side. That's where the spiritual side is also. It's over there on the intuitive side. So anyway, let me get back onto the subject here. So we have these cells of reality, let's say, of consciousness, and it is expanding its memory and expanding its patterns. And then it finds out that it can just switch between a 1 and a 0 or an A or a B back and forth, and it's just created a metronome. Oh, now there's not only time that you have because before the choice and after the choice, but now you have a thing called regular time. And now it can not only make patterns, it can make sequences. And sequences of patterns and patterns of sequences, and it can get more and more complex. As it gets more complex, there's more order, it's lowering its entropy. So we come to a very basic thing in my model, and that is an information system, consciousness, evolves by lowering its entropy. And the entropy just isn't putting all the bits in a row. That's a very low order of entropy. It's the meaning, the significance of those bits. So you discover mathematics and arithmetic and addition and subtraction, and which leads to algebra, which leads to calculus, which leads to differential equations, which goes on and on. All of that then comes later. It's all, again, the logic of quantity. So all those things will develop from this one consciousness cell. Now, there's two ways to think of this, and they both go to exactly the same place, and they're equivalent entirely. One of them is the cell that just keeps growing and expanding and evolving, and everything that happens is all part of its memory. Hawkins said in his last line of his book, he said, perhaps we're all just, a flicker in the mind of God. Well, that's something like that. It's just this one thing, and we're part of that vast memory in the mind of God. But the other way is that those little consciousness cells do what biological cells did. They split. Now you've got 2, and then 4, and then 8, and then they cooperate and connect and work with each other, and eventually you end up something like us say that we did in biology with 4 trillion cells all cooperating with each other. Each one of those cells is sort of like a bacterium. So our bodies are composed of trillions of bacteria, if you like, that are all cooperating with each other. So now we have the idea that consciousness is an information system. The information system evolves to states of lower entropy. Okay, now it grows and evolves and keeps evolving to lower and lower entropy. And eventually it hits a plateau, because what it needs is new possibilities to evolve into, new ways, new patterns, new sequences, new ways of looking at things. Well, it kind of hits a plateau because it's just one mind. It's one monolithic consciousness. And it can only think what it can think. So what it does is the same thing cell did. We had a lot of little one-celled creatures, and what they did is that they created something else out of itself. It took a subset out of itself. So you have this larger conscious system, monolithic, takes a subset out of itself, which means it partitions off some memory and some processing and whatever. In computer terms, we call that a virtual machine inside the mainframe. That's how thousands of people can log onto a mainframe, because each person gets a little chunk of memory, gets a chunk of processing and so on. And that's a virtual computer inside a big computer. So it partitions off a piece of itself and gives that piece of itself free will, that it can make choices as well. It has all the stuff it needs to make choices. It has processing and so on. So now it has free will. Well, when you have multiple things all with free will, they begin to diverge. They end up having different experiences, different ways of seeing things, different attitudes. So it makes thousands, tens of thousands, millions of these things, and they all have free will. Now you have arguments and discussions and challenges, and that creates another much larger set of possibilities, because the possibilities of the group are much greater than the possibilities of the monolithic thing. Okay, now we're getting closer and closer to the kind of us. So those little pieces, I call them individuated units of consciousness. They're just subsets of the larger system, and they have all the same properties of the system. They're just smaller, not as much processing, not as much memory. They're just a smaller unit. So they can evolve themselves to be as low entropy as the system itself, but they'll never be as big because they're subsets. Okay, but they can be as good. They can lower their entropy as well. So that's us. We are these individuated units of consciousness. Now, the first virtual reality that this system made, now it's a system, it's got the big consciousness still there, but a lot of subsets that have free will. The first virtual reality, and a virtual reality is basically a rule set. Everybody that joins this game has to obey by these rules. That defines a virtual reality. First virtual reality was communication protocols. How could they communicate with each other? Well, you need vocabulary and syntax and all that sort of thing. So that was the first virtual reality. Join this group and you get to communicate by these rules. You abide by those rules. And you can change the rules, but you have to have rules for the communication. But the second virtual reality was all of those individuated units of consciousness with their free will. They needed to make better choices. They needed to make choices that lowered their entropy. Okay, that's what consciousness does. It's an information system. It evolves by lowering its entropy. It's hard to lower your entropy in what I call a big chat room. All these little pieces of consciousness, they can all communicate with each other now, but they could say whatever they wanted to say. There wasn't a whole lot of traction or a whole lot of significance in that, and they grew up very slowly. So the larger consciousness system, that was the daddy of them all, the father, if you will, it decided it had to create another virtual reality, but one that had a very tight rule set, one that would define every interaction. Every interaction would be defined, and every interaction could affect every other reaction. In other words, it's a tight rule set, which is the way our universe, what we call the physical universe, is a virtual reality with a tight rule set. Everything has a certain energy, right? A certain momentum, a certain state vector. It can do things, but when it does things, let's say if it moves its energy this way, then that affects somebody over there. And that thing then responds to that. And when it responds, it changes, it interacts with people next to it and so on. So it's a very interactive space where everything requires an energy exchange of some sort. So it's very interactive. Now, it creates this virtual reality, not like we create virtual realities, we program them. This one was created by coming up with a rule set and a set of initial conditions, punching the run button, and let the initial conditions change according to the rules. And we do this in computer science labs. We've been doing that for 20 years in computer science labs, where You come up with rule set and conditions, and you see where it goes. And then you play with the conditions and play with the rule set, and it goes different places. So it did that, and I call that the big digital bang. And the initial conditions were a ball of plasma, high temperature, high pressure, and when the run button was hit, it expanded according to the rule set. And you've all heard the Big Bang. It expands, it creates suns and planets and so on. So that's the big digital bang, so to speak. So our reality then evolved as a simulation in a computer based on a rule set and initial conditions. Now, that rule set is what scientists are supposed to do. They dig out the rules. What are the rules in this virtual reality? Well, if I flap my arms, am I going to fly? No. Rule set doesn't support it. I get brain damage because I fell off a cliff. Maybe I no longer have memory, and maybe I drag my left foot when I walk because of that. Well, that's because the rule set says that with that damage, that would be the consequence. You see? So this virtual reality perked along until it developed entities within the virtual reality by evolution. So it evolved again, stars, suns, planets, Earth, biological cells, plants, animals, people, all got developed. Now, here's an interesting part of this. You have these entities interacting, and they evolve by lowering their entropy. Now, I'm going to associate lowering their entropy with love. There's a connection between lowering entropy and love. Take a group of people and another group of people that's identical, put them all in a separate space, and this group of people, let's say, are the love group. They all care about each other. They're all helpful. They're all interested in being part of the solution for everybody. Okay, and here's the fear group over here. They're fearful. When you're fearful, you don't trust. When you're fearful, it's all about you. You become very self-centered. You want to grab whatever you can grab and fight to keep it and so on. So you let these two groups just evolve and see where they go. Well, what do you think? Which one is the low entropy and the high entropy? It's rather obvious, isn't it? The low entropy group will optimize. They will optimize whatever resources they have for all the people involved. That's the low entropy solution. The fear group will initially, they'll just beat each other up for a while to try to get each other's stuff because it's all about them, self-centered. Then they'll realize that there's powers in numbers, and they'll group up into various groups. Now, this group can take a lot of stuff because there's 20 people in that group, and they can beat up all sorts of people with that power. So then another one gets 20 for a defense against that group, and then another one, and so on it goes. And eventually, enough time, you end up with what we have in our world, which is a fear-based world for the most part. You have a lot of groups, nation-states we call them, and it's all about offense and defenses. How much can you get, and can you keep it and hold it? So you end up with that kind of a reality, and that's a very high entropy. High entropy means that you don't have optimal solutions. It means that 90% of the resources are controlled by 5% of the people. And you have hierarchy, the people on top and next levels and so on. So it turns out kind of like us. So that tells you that consciousness, this is modeled best by an information system, and consciousness evolves to lower its entropy. Consciousness evolves toward love, toward cooperation, caring, sharing. That's how consciousness evolves. That's the direction. So I said you make choices. Consciousness makes choices. Well, if it makes those choices toward becoming love, then it evolves. If it makes those choices toward becoming fearful, it de-evolves. So now you have consciousness with free will that can evolve or de-evolve based on its own free will choices. Now, we'll go back to connecting that with the virtual reality. So now this virtual reality that is just evolving ends up with monkeys and people and whales and everything in it. All those entities can be conscious. How do you get to be conscious? How do you and I end up with consciousness? It's because some piece of consciousness, the things I call the individuated units of consciousness, take a subset of themselves and log it on to an avatar. But the system had to wait until the avatars were capable of making ethical and moral choices that were between low entropy and high entropy choices. So it got to humans, and that was good. Now, did the system meddle a little bit, that process? Sure. We all do that. It was going along, and we wasn't getting any good avatars, so it probably meddled a little here and meddled a little there to make it come out the way it wanted it to. But for the most part, it just let it run. If you just let things run, then it's completely coherent. Everything, kind of like has its cause. You don't have suddenly things change. So that tells us, who are we? We're pieces of consciousness. We are logged on to a human avatar. That avatar is computed, same as the avatar in a computer game. Okay, now if you play a computer game, some kind of virtual reality computer game, there's only two things that are active there, only two things that are real. One, the computer, and two, the player. The actual game, the World of Warcraft, the elves and the barbarians or the sim characters, pardon my old view of virtual reality games, I'm not up to current times with that. My memory goes back to what my kids played, and my kids are all now 40 or approaching 40, so I go back a ways. But anyhow, you have just two things, the computer and the player, that are active, real things. The virtual reality is just computed. It's eye candy. It gives you something to look at so that you can tell what's going on in the game. If you had to look at a printout and figure it out, it would be hopeless. But they make a nice, pretty picture of what's going on and who's doing what. Then you can look at it and at a glance, kind of understand the environment you're in and what your choices are. Okay, so if you're playing that game, let's say you're an elf in some game. Well, let's say you're an elf and you're aware, or at least you think you're aware. Where would the computer be? A computer would be non-physical, because to the elf, that virtual reality is what's physical. So the computer would be non-physical. And what would the player be? Well, you think you're the player. I'm the player. I'm the elf. But the player has to talk to the computer. Elves in virtual realities can't talk to the computer. They're computed by the computer.
Connected to the larger consciousness system.
Connected to the larger, yes. So it's a piece of consciousness, has to talk. The two things that are passing data back and forth is the free will awareness unit, which is really a piece of the individual unit of consciousness. It's talking to the computer. It gets a data stream. It looks at that data and interprets it as this reality. Okay, just like you look at a million dots of light on your screen, or if you got a really good screen, maybe 2 million dots of light on your screen, and you look at all those dots, and each dot has a color, a brightness, and a position. That's it. You got 3 pieces of information for every dot. You look at all those millions of dots, and you see streams and rivers and barbarians and houses and doorknobs on the doors of those houses. And the rule set says you have to turn the doorknob before the door will open, and you abide by the rule set. So that's a very quick idea that says what we are. We're in a virtual reality. Consciousness is the computer. Consciousness is an information system, so it can take a piece of itself and configure it as a computer to be the rendering engine for this virtual reality, so that the pieces of consciousness can make choices that are meaningful and significant and carry a lot of weight. And by those choices that they make, they evolve positively toward love, or they evolve backwards. They de-evolve toward fear. So that's kind of the overall model. Now, as crazy as that sounds, I got there not because I sat down one day and thought this all up. I got there because at around, I don't know, in my early know, really my middle 20s, myself and a fellow that worked with me, Dennis Menrick, we got with Bob Monroe.
Yeah. Tom, before we jump into that story, because I think it's actually really important to see how you arrived at this point, just as a recap, because we covered, I know, which is probably the tip of the iceberg of your theory and understanding of it all, but to help kind of me digest and everybody digest the overview of what you just gave, we started at the fact that consciousness is fundamental.
Yes.
And that because we can observe that reality is information-based, we could extrapolate that there is a larger consciousness system that has a rule set of time, space, and matter, which within we are you could say that we are individuated units of consciousness. And within this reality, the perception of evolution is to move from fear to love. And by lowering entropy, we evolve. And so when we're reflecting on who we are, what this reality is, we could pick apart many of those things. But what's interesting to me is what's in our apparent differences of ethnicity and the place we were raised in and the memory that we accumulated and the illusion of separation between Tom and Andre that feel like two separate things. What's unanimous within both of our experience is that there is an experience of awareness, that individuated unit of awareness of consciousness that you spoke to, and how in recognizing that we see how we are much more alike than we are different.
Yes. Matter of fact, that old saying that says we're all one is a fact. We are. We all come from the same system. We're all pieces of consciousness from one system. So we really are all individuated pieces of one thing.
And you came to this experientially first because you were a nuclear physicist who was on your path, very much so on the side of logic, how you spoke to there's two paths of knowing, intuition and logic. You are on the path very much so of the intellect, and then you got exposed to these practices via Bob Monroe and TM, and walk us through your journey of how you arrived there.
Okay. I was had a master's already, working on my PhD, and in those were the bad old days of computing where there were punch cards, and debugging software was a really hard thing to do because they didn't have debugging software and they didn't have anything other than, I'm sorry, your job didn't run. That's all the information you'd get. So I found, just after learning how to meditate, I did TM, learned how to meditate, and it was very easy for me. I picked up on it instantly. And I found that I could go into a meditation state, let the printout of my cards, my punch cards, which would be like a listing on a computer roll, and I could see that where the cards were that had a problem, that were creating errors.
It would just appear in your awareness?
It would just appear in my awareness. I mean, I'd actually see the list. I'd see most of it's black, and here'd be a red line, and I'd back up, and I'd look at it, and I'd recognize the line because I wrote all the code.
So you would gain cognition of information that was not derived through the intellect.
Exactly.
But it was still valid.
Yes. And at first when I did that, I thought, well, that's fun, but it probably doesn't work. And I went and I found that it did work. It was precise. And I started playing with it more. And it got easier and better as I went. And I could even find errors in those cards that had nothing to do with my programming. They were errors in positioning the hole that the card punch. If it's a 1/10 of a millimeter in the wrong space, it's unreadable by the computer.
And that's because both the cards or the bugs and yourself as a unit of consciousness share both in that information stream. Like that data stream you both have access to, because people, I would just love for you, and you can continue to go through your story, but how it's physically possible or non-physically possible that you could have access to something beyond the intellect.
Yes, well,
that way.
That information is in a database, and the database is required in order to render the virtual reality. In order to render this virtual reality, it needs certain information to do the rendering, and we can get into that later. You know, how does the system know what's going to happen next? Because this is not a bottom-up where the last set creates the next set. This is probability. So the system has to know how to do that. It does it with a random draw from a probability distribution of the possibilities. So it has to know what the possibilities are, and it has to know what's the probability of each of those possibilities, and that's the data set that's available. Now, the ancient Hindus called that the Akashic records, and as far as they know, it just was there because it was there. I know why it's there, because it's necessary to run the virtual reality. For the rendering engine has to have that information, or it can't run the virtual reality. So I tapped into that. And everything is there because everything is rendered. Everything here, everything physical, including those cards and the key punch and the holes, and everything's being rendered. And the machine that reads those cards, all of that's being rendered. And it's according to the rule set. So all the information is there, and you can connect to that information with your consciousness, because that's all in consciousness. You really are a piece of consciousness, so you're part of that consciousness system, and the information is available to you. But it's not available to you through your intellect. It's available to you through your intuition. You connect to it, kind of mind to mind, if you will. You make a connection to that database, and it's like any other database. You can query it and you get answers, and then you refine your query and you'll get better answers and refine it again.
Have you found that's all is necessary? Like the intention, or when you say set a query?
Yeah. Yes, that's all that's necessary. That's the only intention with a consciousness. An intention of a consciousness is, as we say in physics, the motive force. It's the thing that makes things happen. It's the only active ingredient. With that intention, you can heal. With that intention, you can get data out of the database. With that attention, you can go visit a past life. With that intention, you can do pretty much anything, because you're a piece of consciousness. You have access to the data that's in consciousness. You can explore that larger consciousness system.
As a quick aside, is there a unique relationship between the information in the data stream and geometry? I'm curious how, like, is that information in, because a lot of people have experiences of geometric shapes and, you know, and mystical experiences where there's inherent information seeming embedded in geometric shapes.
Well, there is information based in geometric shapes, but that information is mostly in the form of mathematics and quantity. You know, geometry, the symmetry itself, you know, has information. How many sides does it have? How long is each side? You know, and they all have to add up to a circumference. So, are the sides regular or are they irregular? So all of that is information that defines the figure. But no, there's nothing inherent in geometry that is, you know, that is between you and the information. Let's put it that way. Now, how that information is stored, how the LCS stores that, what form is it stored in? You know, is it like we store information in bits, or do they have some other more elegant and efficient way of storing information? Well, I don't know that. All I know is that the information is there and it's not geometry dependent. But why would people get this, you know, and it happens a lot, get these geometric things? Well, the geometric shapes are a metaphor for order. They're a metaphor for purpose. In other words, you don't get a hexagram out of randomness. If you see geometric shapes and you see things are made of that, to me, that's a metaphor for saying this is purposeful. This is ordered.
Coherent.
There's coherence here and structure. And that's really the metaphor, not so much that hexagram has special meaning in and of itself, other than it's a good metaphor for the structure and the coherence of consciousness. So it tells us that. A lot of things that we get from the larger conscious system are metaphorical. Mostly they're metaphorical. So it's usually an error if you look at it as a precise thing. You have to look at it more as a metaphor, something that gives you a sense of a bigger thing. It's symbolic. Our dreams are that way. When we dream, we sometimes dream in details, but basically our dreams are metaphors that we can interpret. Oh, this means that. And this person was a symbol for this other thing. And, you know, they're metaphorical. And your connections with the larger conscious system particularly if you're asking questions, they have a kind of a strong metaphorical bias to them. If you're asking very specific questions like, where's the error in this line? Well, then you get a very specific answer. You don't get a metaphor. You get an answer that says, repunch the card. Retype in, into the card punch and get a new card, and that'll fix the problem. So you get that as an answer.
So then what happened to you as you were experiencing these things?
Well, like I say, I was working on my PhD at the university. I realized my mind had access to information that was unknowable even. You can't look at a card and say, oh, that hole isn't there. It's a tenth of a millimeter, one way or another. And that's totally impossible to see that visually. So it wasn't just that it was getting information somehow out of the depth of my own consciousness that I knew when I punched that key that it was going to be wrong. It obviously knew things that were information that was unavailable, period. Unavailable. If you'd got a bunch of people together and say, what's wrong with this line of code? They would have said nothing. And then maybe you would concluded, well, let's repunch it and see if it was an error. But there's nothing looking at it would tell you it was an error. So that was information that was obviously not out of the physical world. And at that point, that changed my whole life. I said, oh, I'm a physicist. What physicists do is we model reality. That's our job, is to model reality. And suddenly there was this whole bigger piece of reality that I was just starting to get a glimpse of, and had nothing to do with the physical world. It was another whole set of reality that had to do with mind and with consciousness. And as a scientist, I wanted to know, how did it work? What could you do? What else could I do with it? And I was inquisitive, so I played with it. And 2 or 3 years later, I got out of school. I went to work, met Dennis Menerick, ran into Bob Monroe, and now I'm 26, 27, something like that. And well, I'm spending now 15 to 20 hours a week with Bob Monroe, and he's teaching myself and Dennis how to go out of body, how to connect intuitively. And we do that, and we get to the point that we can do it exactly whenever we want to. It's not a long process. It's a short process. You can go from aware here to aware someplace else in fractions of a second and still be here. You can parallel process more than one reality. So I learned all these things and how to reproduce it pretty exactly so that I could do science there. So I could say, okay, I've learned how to heal people, and it works. I've healed 200 people, and some of them you don't know. Maybe their headache got better anyway. You don't really know. But other times, somebody who hasn't walked for 10 years and are told that they'll never walk again, and you work on them and they get up and dance. So you get things like that, and suddenly that's very evidential. But it just happened once. Maybe it was a fluke. So you keep doing it. Eventually, you get the idea that you're able to heal. So I started doing research on it. Well, if I change this variable, how does that affect the result? And sometimes it would have a negative effect, sometimes a positive effect, sometimes no effect at all. And 35 years later, I had a real good idea how all the paranormal stuff worked, because I was able to do it and do research like that with what could I do differently and how would that affect the result? So I came up with models of all the paranormal things. And then I wrote the books, and the book was mainly a thesis on consciousness. And I knew that it also had to derive the physical, because I knew consciousness was fundamental. I knew consciousness had to lead to science, but I didn't exactly know how. And then about 3 years after I published the books, it came to me. A friend I was working with said something to me that just was the right word at the right time, and it jarred my mind, and I go, oh, that's how it works. And then after that, I got quantum physics, I got relativity, and I started solving all the things, both in philosophy and physics, and some things in psychology and metaphysics. They all fell into place. Everything made sense, including the paranormal. So I had all these puzzle pieces that I gathered in 30 years of spending probably 20 hours a week working on it. It's like a half-time job. And I had 100 or 1,000 puzzle pieces. I knew this was true, and that was true, and that was true. But what would pull them all together? So they all worked out from one idea, one conception had pulled them all together. And I had to include all the physical stuff I knew as a physicist. All of that had to also fit together with the one idea. And then when the solution to quantum physics came, then all the rest of it poured in within the next 6 months. It just all fell, as the pieces go together, it's easier to fit the pieces in. The hardest part is the first 10 parts of the puzzle are really difficult, but the more you get it done, the easier it is to fill in the other parts. So the other parts filled in pretty quickly. And at first, up until just probably a year and a half ago, I would have told you that I had a model, a reality model, not necessarily the model. I'd just come up with this model, and it worked really well, but I didn't have an idea that maybe something else might work better. But after years and years and years searching for that other thing, searching for a flaw, what is it in my model that doesn't work? What is in there that is not logical? Is there anything it does not explain? And if so, why? What's the hang up? And years of searching for problems, I didn't find any. And eventually, I realized that there wasn't any other answer. This was the only answer that had come out because it was logical. There wasn't any other way to get to the same thing. Now, you could get to the same thing with different metaphors. I'll tell you, there's only one truth, but there's thousands of ways that you can reach that truth. There's not just one path to that truth. Thousands of ways to reach that truth. But eventually, you get to the point that all of them converge to the same answer, and that is the way reality is. That's then the truth. And all of the other ways can be explained based on that truth. And all the other ways are useful. They're all helpful. There isn't just one path to take to the truth. Lots of paths will lead you to the truth. But there is just one truth because that's the truth. The truth isn't, a double or triple function. All three of these are the truth. No, there's just one that's the truth. So that was how I ended up here, is I had all of this experience out of body. I did all the things paranormal. I'd let something talk through me. I did that kind of thing. I would, we'd go up and have a microphone over our lips, and we'd tell Bob what we were experiencing, and he would give us suggestions of what to do or what to ask for or something. So he was in the control room, and Dennis and I were in these isolation booths. Matter of fact, the booth that I was in was also a Faraday cage. It was isolated from all electromagnetic fields as well. And if you do that thousands of times, you get not only pretty good at it, but you get to understand why things work the way they do, because you tried it enough different ways that you understand what works and what doesn't and why, and you can explore those differences. So that's what I did. Eventually led me to the bigger picture for everything. The big breakthrough, I was about 2/3 of the way writing my book, and the big breakthrough was that consciousness was an information system. I didn't start with that. I ended up with that because that's the one thing that tied all the pieces together. And then bingo, all these pieces fell in, and there's the picture. So it took me a lot of years. This wasn't a quick trail to this model. It took a lot of time, but I'm a scientist. I'm a physicist, so I don't mind going slowly. It has to be logical. It has to be such that I can describe it to another scientist and they can end up at the same conclusion. So though the leap is large, it's a new paradigm, and that paradigm is huge, but it works, and it does answer these questions in physics. It is a better physics. It describes things that the physics knows are true but can't understand. It's also, like I say, it's a model of the subjective as well. If you're unhappy or you're sad or you're struggling, it can tell you why, and it can tell you what you need to do to not be unhappy and struggling and what's causing that. And it's interesting because Of course, the Buddha, you know, Jesus, Muhammad, all of the big stars, and I guess Lao Tzu, was also, he wasn't the only one, but in the Tao, all of these got to the same answer. When it's all the dust settles, I'm not saying anything that hasn't been said at least 4 times by different people. It's all the same stuff because they got to that truth, but they got there and explained it to what I would call poetry. You have to know how to interpret it. You have to know how to interpret their words. A materialist reads the words that the Buddha said, this is all Maya, it's all an illusion. They go, nonsense. Physical world is the physical world. This is the stuff. So if you can't interpret the words, then it's just poetry. You read the Bhagavad Gita and there's some guy on a chariot fighting a war, and what the hell does that mean? And what's going on there? But if you understand what's being said, the poetry that you have to interpret, then it can be a very meaningful discussion of life and connections with other people and thinking and attitudes. There's a lot of things there that are very important. But my work, I wanted to not have people have to interpret it. I wanted to be logically clear so that the left-brainers in the world, those logical process people that have to go from A to B logically or they can't get there, that's an on-ramp for them. So the logical process people can get the My Big Toe trilogy and find themselves having a good understanding of the paranormal, of spirituality, the nature of our reality, why things work the way they do, and they not only will find better physics, but they'll find themselves in there, and they'll find what's their mission, what are they here for, what's the meaning of life? Well, the meaning of life is to lower your entropy, to grow, to become love. That's why you're here. You're here in an entropy reduction trainer. And just like a flight trainer, that the pilots get into, this is an entropy reduction trainer run by the larger consciousness system. And we interact with each other, creating challenges for each other. And the way we make choices is what really counts. So, most people run their life this way. They try to manipulate what's going to happen. Well, I want my kids to grow up and be professionals. I want my wife to, do this and that and be a really good cook. I want to do this. So you kind of have these ideas and you're constantly applying a little pressure here and a little pressure there and manipulating information, trying to make the world come out the way it's best and the way that's good for everybody from your own viewpoint. And you're constantly struggling because it never works. That's not a good way to approach life. A better way is let whatever happens, happens. And what's important is not what happens, but how you deal with it. That's what's important. So if you change the gears on life, stop trying to make it come out the way is best for yourself and everybody else, and just let it be and deal with it positively. Deal with it. Find the low entropy path there as best you can. And if you can't, and you're wrong, you make a higher entropy choice, well, that's okay. No penalty. The whole point is learning. What's the problem is if you don't learn. If it's a failure to learn, then that is not so good. But making mistakes, coming up with the wrong answer, that's fine. That's the path of learning. We learn from making mistakes. So I think this is the low entropy path, and I take it, no, it creates a lot of trouble. Then I have to think about that. Why did I miss that? Why didn't I understand that trouble was likely to happen? And then I learned from it. It was something about me, probably some fear I had or some other blinder on that I didn't see that as a possibility or I didn't understand those people very well. I was judging them and, here's the way they are and here's the way they work, and that judgment was all wrong. So that tells me to stop judging people. So you learn from it, and then your life gets better and better because now you're in this virtual reality leveling up, doing what you should be doing, growing, becoming love, and you'll find that you end up happy most of the time. You smile, life is good. It doesn't matter so much what happens. It's all how you deal with it that matters.
What are some other telltale signs that you're living in alignment with the larger consciousness system. If it is the primary purpose to lower entropy, uh, if one is doing that, what would be the byproducts of that in life?
Well, one really easy way to kind of measure how you're doing is to look at the last, I don't know, whatever you can remember, say the last week. Go back in your memory and remember what you did for the last week, or if you can, only the last day, that's all right. But remember it. And if during that day or week, keep track of how many times you had negative feelings. When did you feel upset, hurt, angry, abused, misunderstood? Well, not just misunderstood, but misunderstood in kind of a negative way. Stress, all of those things. There was certainly anger, upset at other people. And think, how many times did I have negative feelings? Most people only have to go back about 2 hours to find a negative feeling. Most people have negative feelings all the time. Just the news makes them angry. You know, everything kind of makes them angry. People that disagree with them makes them angry. But if you grow up, that's not the case. You can say, well, I haven't had any negative feelings for as long back as I can see. Well, now you're doing really, really well. You are a low entropy person. If you're the average person, you have negative feelings off and on regularly. As you grow up, it's less and less. So that's how you can tell about how you're doing. Just the negative feelings. Annoyed, upset. Shouldn't be that way. Those people, they're screwing it all up for the rest of us, you know. This kind of attitude. And we tend to blame everybody else for the things that we don't like. George made me angry. George doesn't make you angry. You choose to be angry. You have some sort of fear, and George just resonated with that fear of yours, and you get angry. So nobody makes you angry. Nobody makes you upset. Nobody makes you have negative feelings. All that comes out of yourself. So when you get rid of the fear, you get rid of the ego, you get rid of the beliefs. Beliefs are traps. You get rid of the beliefs. You're a happy camper. You enjoy your life. You smile a lot. You laugh, you play, and you're very productive. You get a lot done. And anything you need or want falls at your feet just as you need and want it. Life just, you seem to be very lucky, but you're not lucky. You're just leveling up in a game that's all about, you know, lowering your entropy, becoming love. So that's how you know. If you look at your life and say, well, my life is just a series of struggles. I thought if I just get past this, if this relationship just worked out, if my boss just gave me this raise, everything would be good after that. And it may be good for a few weeks after that, or maybe even a few months, but you always end up back in that same spot with this hurdle that you have to get by or have to get over. If I could just get over this, and if that were true, everything would be downhill after that. And it doesn't work that way. The only way everything is downhill after that is if you grow up and start caring and sharing and cooperating, having compassion. You help people. You stop asking, what's in it for me? And instead you ask, how can I help? Then your life gets to be good and happy.
To bring this down to the immediately practical for people, if one wants to begin exploring in any program to develop one's own consciousness, I've heard you speak to how it must therefore start by getting acquainted and spending time exploring your own consciousness. So for those that want to deepen on that path of exploration, is meditation the place that you advise most people to start?
Well, meditation is the kind of the given answer to that question. Yes, everybody starts with meditation, but it's not the only path. There are two paths, and meditation has been the path of choice for centuries, if not millennia. get acquainted with your own mind. Quiet your mind. Learn to be able to sit for as long as you want to, an hour, 2 hours with this, no thoughts. Just be with your own mind. When you get into that space, you let the world go. Your senses are no longer processing sense data. So you're really not here anymore, because processing sense data is what defines here. So you're not really here anymore. And where are you? You're just, it's the Descartes moments. You just, I think, therefore I am. I'm conscious, I'm aware, therefore I am. And when you get there, all you need from that point is an intention to do whatever it is you want to do. Now you are a mind in the consciousness system, and you are able to explore that system, gather data from that system, meet others out there in the non-physical, talk to dead people, whatever you want, that's available to you. But it's not just as easy as learning to meditate and there it is. It takes time to develop that intuitive side, and it takes understanding. So it's not a quick thing. But I had a lot of students who had trouble with meditation. And some of them, it wasn't anything attitudinal. It was just they're like ADD. Sitting still and having a quiet mind is pretty much impossible when you have a central nervous system that's jumping here and jumping there, and say, oh, just let everything go. And they can't do that. And I also had a lot of very left brain logic process types who just couldn't let go of that control. That anything that would happen on the intuitive side, that logical side would come in and crash it, wanted to analyze it, judge it right away, which would kill it, of course, because now you're in that logical side, and the logical side and the intuitive side don't work together. Now, you can teach them to work together, but most people, they don't. You can learn to be extremely right-brained, extremely intuitive, and extremely logical, both. You can be extreme in both cases, but that's only after a lot of years of practice do you get there. But there is another way for people who have trouble meditating, whether it's an overactive intellect or whether it's just some central nervous system twitch that they can't let go of, and that is through your imagination. It's an alternate path. And once I realized that, I wanted to make tools for those people, because that whole bunch of people who had been hanging out in my circles for years, and they still never had that out of body, was never successful at the paranormal things. So I developed this thing I called Tom's Park, which uses imagination to get to the same place. And the way you use that is you have to imagine something with enough information to basically consume your mind. So you imagine where you are. You're walking at a beach, but you're not just at a beach. You hear the surf. You see the surf going in and out. You hear the birds, and you feel the sand between. You can smell the salt water. So you smell, you taste, you hear, you see, you touch. All of those things have to be going in detail. And if you can practice, it takes practice to get that, and you get that detail going, then start off on a story. What do you find on that beach? Who else do you run into? And eventually, you stop playing the parts of all the characters like you do in a daydream, and the thing just takes on a life of its own. The people you meet, the things they say are not things that are even in your mind. And the story goes, what happens is the larger conscious system takes that story you've made and just continues it, and then takes you into a space where you've got something to learn. So it's another way to get out of body, if you will, to get into the non-physical space. You can do it through your imagination. And meditation usually is a beginner's tool. I know that's heresy to a lot of meditators, but it's mostly a beginner's tool. After you learn well enough, you can do that meditation in seconds. You don't have to sit down and quiet your mind and say your mantra and do all kind of stuff. You're there. So you kind of stop the process and get there very quickly eventually. And from my own experience, I'd say that, how often do you meditate? They asked me. I said, well, I really don't meditate anymore. On the other hand, an equivalent answer is I meditate all the time. I'm always in a meditation state. So they're both true, equally true. You can just see it from either side. I'm in constant meditation state. And to let the sense data go, I can do that in fractions of a second. So it's just a matter of you get so familiar with that intuitive state in that space that you can just go there very easily. And life becomes different in the sense that now you have a much bigger decision space. Most people have a decision space that combines of their memory and the stuff they get from their senses, that it's interacting. So there's certain choices they have based on that. Once you live equally in an intuitive space or equally able to get around an intuitive space and an intellectual space, you find that you spend most of your time in the intuitive space because that's has more information in it. It's a richer space than the physical space. So you live, say, 75, depends on the situation, 75, sometimes 80, 90, sometimes only 50, sometimes 40, but most of the time you exist in a state that is more intuitive than it is logical. And then you can pop into the logical state whenever you need to. And I have found that the two sides that seem to be incompatible, that intuitive state and that logical state, intellectual state, actually become good friends and work well with each other. And the intuitive side will get some information and pass it over to the intellectual side to do some assessment on it, do some analysis on it. And then that side that's intellectual will pass over stuff because it needs more information. It doesn't have enough information to do a logical problem. And then the intuitive side goes up and gets the information, passes it over to the intellectual side. So then you become not left brain or right brain, but whole brain. And all of that works together. And you just live in a larger reality than most people. You have the size of your reality is measured by the size of your decision space. So now you meet somebody and you know some things about them right away. Within 10 or 20 seconds, you got a sense of that person and who they are and what's inside and why they do what they do and all the rest of it, which makes it easier for you to be useful and to be helpful with those people. So you live in a space that is intuitive, but you're also rational and logical at the same time. So that's really where you're going to. If you're looking for end states, that's really where you're going to that sort of a thing. But that takes a long time to do that, and it takes a lot of effort because you have three sources of information that come to you. One's the larger conscious system, sends you a data stream. All consciousness is netted. So you can communicate with any other consciousness, including your dogs and your cats and your horse and the bumblebees. You can communicate with anything that's conscious. And consciousness can send messages back and forth that way. Telepathy is a real thing.
Yeah, we just had Kai Dickens with the telepathy tapes on here last week. The timing of this conversation's right.
Well, the reason that those autistic children seem to be good at that is because their intellectual side was damaged. Their intellectual side doesn't work. So if you've got these two sides, an intellectual side and an intuitive side, and the intellectual side doesn't work, what do? You start developing your intuitive side. And can you hear what your mother's thinking? Of course you can. Consciousnesses are all netted. Of course you can hear that.
So that's the first. You said there's three.
Yes, that's the first, is the larger conscious system. The second is conscious to consciousness. Somebody can be sending you a message. Somebody can be putting thoughts into your mind. Okay, yes. Oh, thoughts into your mind. Yeah, we can talk about that later. But they can give you ideas and feelings and suggestions and things. And the third is that you're a piece of consciousness and you can create virtual realities yourself. You can create information. So those three things, it's yourself, it's somebody else with the consciousness or some other thing with the consciousness, or it's a larger conscious system. And unfortunately, those three streams don't come with tags. You never know where it's coming from. So you have to be skeptical of everything. Now, even with experience, you'll never know precisely where it's coming from. But with experience, you'll get, well, that's an 80, that's a 90. Oh, that's a 99.99. I'm real familiar with that one, you know. So you get to where you can label those, and you get even familiar with the stuff that you create yourself. But one has to always be skeptical. You never know the source of what you get, and you never know exactly why you're getting it, okay? It's something you get from the larger conscious system, something you've asked for, but is that really because that's true, or you're getting this because that's information you need to know to grow and to learn? So you can't say, oh, there's a fact. You can just say, oh, there's something. I wonder what that means and how it's going to affect me. So the question is not, is that real? The question is that helpful? So you get information from lots of sources, and this idea about reality is just a bad idea. Information is real. That's the only, consciousness is real. Conscious information system. So information is real, and that's the only thing that's real. Everything else is a virtual reality. When you die, you end up in another virtual reality. When you dream, you're in another virtual reality. When you daydream, you're in another virtual reality. The daydreams, you start by creating them yourself. You know, the outer body is another virtual reality.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about how these are useful terms, but also they fall short in many ways. You know, it's helpful to conceptualize reality as a virtual system or as a computer that's being rendered. And I think for some people throughout culture could maybe refer back to the movie The Matrix. And there's a lot of overlap here. You kind of remind me of The Architect. I don't know, you probably heard that before.
I've heard that before, yeah.
But, you know, when the Oracle especially is talking with Neo, and the reason we're here is to understand the why behind the decisions that we're making, and how information that's coming through these three different streams are ultimately, we're here to learn the reason of, if something inherently doesn't appear to be reducing entropy in a given decision, we will then learn why that was the case, and then and go on to evolve from that decision.
You're absolutely right. All of those things. That's why I started off saying these are just metaphors. Larger conscious system is a metaphor for source. IUOC, individual unit conscious, just a metaphor for that function that has to happen. So I went through the logical steps that had to be in this model. I gave them names, but it's just a model. It's a way of thinking about it. It's a way that helps you put structure to reality. And that's all it is. You know, it's no more than a way of looking at things that makes better sense. And yeah, people get hung up on, you know, well, what does that IUOC do, you know, when it's got free will awareness unit out there? What is it doing? He's just sitting around, is it communicating? And I said, yeah, you're pushing the metaphor too far. It's just there for a function of the accumulator for the experiences that the free will units have. That's all. That's its function. Don't add more to it. I just have the functions of the essential functions of consciousness. And you start to complicate it with asking questions that really aren't relevant. Doesn't matter what it does all day. These are the key ideas, and these are just ways of sorting it, words that help people understand. I use the computer metaphors because they're more understandable today. You know, if you use the metaphors that the Buddha used, well, that goes back to poetry. You have to understand, you have to be able to understand, you have to know what he knows in order to understand what he says, which is a chicken and egg problem. So anyhow, yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. This is not, these are the facts. There is this thing out there, and it has these piece parts. These are all, it's a way of looking at things that makes better sense. That's all.
It's helpful to see the inherent limits of our logic, and what it has the unique capacity to do. Because a lot of us who, again, live in this culture where the intellect is premier source of intelligence, we want and we crave that feeling of satiation to understand how things connect. And I love that part of me. I know you strongly have that part of you as well. But then again, it gets to that point where it's important to surrender knowing to the deeper intuitive source that is different and beyond what we can logically, empirically deduce.
Right. It starts from what I was saying about we don't have the vocabulary to describe abstract things. We don't have a vocabulary of the words or even the thoughts to describe consciousness. What is it? Where is it? Well, it's nowhere. Doesn't have any extent. There isn't distance there. Well, how does it work? How does it pass information around? You're looking for details that really aren't important. You just have to understand its function and how it works and let the rest go, because what you're doing is trying to take that abstraction and turn it into something concrete. And that's wrong. This virtual reality is what we see as concrete, and we want it to be like this virtual reality with piece parts that we can assemble and take them apart and lay them out on a bench so we can see how all the details work. But it's not like that at all. We're talking about a thing that's alive and conscious and aware, and it doesn't have an extent. It doesn't have to pass data around. It just knows. Well, everything has to pass data around. Well, only if it has extent. Extent doesn't have to be there. It's just consciousness. Stop trying to look at all its piece parts and try to understand what it is and how you relate to it and it relates to you. That's what's important. One of the key points that people have to understand as they're trying to wrap their heads around this is that this isn't something that you can just get intellectually. If it's not your experience, it can't be your truth. So you may read about it and you may think, oh, that sounds true, and I can see how all that works. But if it's not your truth, if you haven't experienced it, it's somebody else's truth. It's the truth of the guy that wrote the book, but it's not your truth. You have to experience it, and you are limited by your experience. If you get things, if data comes to you and it's outside of your experience, you don't know how to interpret it. Now, you can make up a story about it and say, oh, well, it's like this, but that's just the story you make up. And then you can believe the story. And that's what most people do. They make up stories and then they believe them. But understanding that if it's not your experience, then it's not going to help you grow up. It's the difference between acting kind and being kind. You can read all about kindness, and you can just be as kind as you can be to everybody you see, but if it's all coming out of your intellect because that's the way you think you should be, you don't gain. You're not leveling up. You have to be kind, not act kind.
Yeah, it really takes a matured person to explore things and receive information that is outside of your experience without accepting or rejecting it, but taking it as a data point and experimenting with it and seeing if it's valid and true. And then it can be your own theory of everything and not just somebody on a podcast you heard once.
Exactly. I say that over and over in my book, that my big toe should just be a starting point for your big toe. If it's not your experience, it's not your truth. And the only way to proceed is with an open mind and a very skeptical mind. Be skeptical of everything and everybody. And the person you have to be most skeptical about is yourself, because we are really good at convincing ourselves that we are pretty wonderful and have all the right ideas. So skepticism is an absolutely necessary part of this path.
But it really helps crack at our notions of how solid and concrete this apparent universe is when you explore and you differentiate PMR and NPMR, physical matter reality and non-physical matter reality. And you start to walk people through, of course, there's a non-physical world. The vast majority of the cosmos is made up of empty space. People are watching this conversation right now by virtue of invisible frequencies that are enabling their device to be able to download and play and watch wherever they are. And so it doesn't seem like that big of a stretch to be exploring in these other topics around more paranormal activities and remote viewing. And I think it's been so fascinating to talk with Kai last week on the telepathy tapes and with you, because it seems like right now there's a cultural shift in our deepening of understanding what consciousness is and the repeatability of these different studies within individuals. And so, what is the gamut of these non-physical experiences that you've had that invite reflections around the afterlife, remote viewing, the paranormal? Just talk us through a little bit of those
Well,
experiences.
they are all related. They're not independent. They're all kind of related. And the active ingredient is always intent, that we can build up all sorts of tools that help us focus that intent. A lot of those tools, we tend to invent tools, create tools, and then we believe in them, and they become not just tools, but they become solid things that are there. Uh, for instance, things like chakras. Now I'm going to upset a whole lot of people, but chakras are not fundamental. They're tools that we create. It helps us understand. It breaks the things we want to understand down into piece parts, and by relating those piece parts to the body, it makes it more concrete, not so abstract. When we, and we need those tools to help explain. You have to take that abstraction, put it into more concrete terms so that people can use their language and their experience to understand what's going on. So they're essential.
I think it's important to differentiate, though, what's perceived as a tool versus what is a reality from the perspective of the physical, and that includes the more subtle realms of our energetic body and makeup and whatnot. And so, I don't fully understand your distinction there.
Okay. Let's talk about healing. Okay, we hear the word light workers. Well, that is people who have the metaphor that what is ill in a person, what is wrong, poor health, is dark, and the darker it is, the worse it is. So if it's really black, then it's maybe a deadly cancerous tumor. If it's just light gray, then maybe it's the flu. If it's just a little bit of gray, it's probably just an irritation or something. So they have that as a kind of an output format of the data that they get from getting into the database and getting information about that person's health. Now, they'll take a bar of light, in Monroe's vocabulary, that's the energy bar tool. But they will put that white energy on that till it burns that black away, and that helps them heal. Well, all of that is just tools. It doesn't exist. Light doesn't really exist. It's the mind, the intention of the mind is what heals. But people need tools to use that intention. If you just said, well, it's just your intent that does it, okay, heal. You're done. You're healed. Well, that wouldn't work. People wouldn't do that because they couldn't get the oomph. They couldn't put the energy in that because that's so unbelievable that could possibly work, that people wouldn't feel like they were doing anything. People have the sense out of being in this seemingly physical reality that you can't change something without doing something. You can't just do it in your mind. You have to do something. So you need your energy bar tool to burn away the black stuff, and that's a tool. Now, a teaching tool is like the chakras, a teaching tool. We have a lot of teaching tools that we use. It helps break things up into parts, give those parts certain attributes, and it helps people understand in a more concrete way. Now, sure, I can look at you and I can see chakras. Well, doesn't that mean they're real? No, it's just information. I can get the data with that output. You see, let's say, look at Ledbetter, Man Visible and Invisible. He wrote a little book and he shows all of these auras around people and he tells you what it means. The yellow up around the head, that's intelligence, and the purple there, that's spirituality. And that big red zigzaggy thing going around, that's anger. Well, that's not real. That was his interpretation, and everybody reads the book, so everybody sees about the same things because that becomes your output format for looking at auras. If you want to, you can redefine that, and you can say, I want a blue zigzag line to be anger, and I want red to be, I don't know, something else. I want red to be health. And then when you get that data, you'll get it in the format that you specify. And you can look at a chart and you can say, well, here's health and here's time. I'd like to see this person's health from now till 10 years from now. And because there's a lot of probability of the way it might go, I want to see 3 sigma error bars around that line of probable health. Well, you can get that. The system will give you anything you like, even with statistical analysis. You just have to specify what your format is that you want, and it'll give it to you in that format. So when you talk about subtle bodies and those things, even the out of body, right? Just the idea. You're not inside your body. You don't have a spirit that lives in your body and comes out through your head and flies off. That's not the way. You're a piece of consciousness. You're already out of your body. Your body is an avatar, and it doesn't have a heart or a brain or anything. It's just eye candy. All that ever gets rendered is just what you can see. Everything inside doesn't get rendered. There doesn't have to render oxygen in this room. We just keep going as if there were oxygen in the room. It's rendering our bodies. The only time it'll render oxygen in the room if you got a test for oxygen, and then it'll render what you need for that test. If you cut somebody's head open, it'll render a brain. And you cut the brain open, it'll render all the neurology in there. But otherwise, it doesn't render any of that. So you don't have a spirit that lives in your body. And if you do an out of body, like I did, I did out of bodies, and I thought the same thing. Well, I'm going to come out of the body. I'm obviously going to be in my bedroom. I'm going to turn around and look at my body. And that's exactly what I did. I turned around, and there's my body laying in the bed, sure enough. But then I realized you don't have to do that. You can become out of body, and you never see your bedroom. It's not there. You're just wherever it is you want to be, in whatever reality frame you want to be in, and it's instantaneous. There's no travel. There's no body. So your consciousness, the body is just computed. It's not a real thing anymore, and your elf is a real thing. Okay, so this idea that you have a body, and then you have a subtle body, and then you have the spiritual body, and all these things are concentric with each other. You get that? Well, that was a model back in the 1800s when Madame Blavatsky and the Theosophists were turning over new ideas and publishing them. And it came from this idea that the spirit lives inside the body. That's why we put our hand over our mouth when we yawn, because you keep evil spirits from going into your mouth. That's where that comes from. So we had those kinds of beliefs back in the day when Fox and Muldoon and so on were writing their books about out of body. There was always cords. A silver cord was attached. And if you cut that cord, the body would die because it would lose its spirit, and the spirit would die because it got connected from its body, and they'd fall over dead. And that isn't the case. When Bob Monroe did all those out of body, he didn't have any silver cord. That was a belief. So we make up a story that explains what we've experienced. So they had a belief about being tethered to the body, so they got a silver cord that represented that belief. Remember, you interpret the data, and you interpret it based on what you know and what you believe and what your fears are. So these things don't actually exist. You don't have an etheric body and whatever. Here's your emotional body. Now, sure, I see those things. If I want to look at your emotional body, I can just call up and say, what's this emotional information look like? And there it is. And I can make it whatever colors I want. As long as I'm consistent, it'll do that. So the data is there, but that you interpret it as a egg of light around a human being, that's a belief. You can look at a picture, a photograph of somebody, and you can look at their emotional body too, and all the rest of their auras. You can look at a spiritual body and a health body. And all those things are just information that you get because you have an intention to get them, and you have some kind of intention of the format you want them in, and it may be just what everybody else sees, or you may make up your own. So that's what I'm saying. There is no real etheric body and subtle body. And
well, I completely hear you. I think the distinction between what is absolute reality and relative reality is important. These ideas of like the inner sciences precede far beyond Blavatsky or, beliefs around what, like there is a rule set. There is
right.
There is a distinction between what is real and what is true. From the perspective of the absolute, there is only consciousness. But from the from the perspective of the relative human experience, we do have these more subtle aspects of ourselves. Like you said, you could tune into, you can perceive these things.
Sure.
But where I think it gets a little bit tricky in articulating this stuff is sometimes it comes across as if this is all, like, everything that we perceive is an illusion. And from an aspect it is, but it is also the illusion that consciousness is playing for the purpose of lowering entropy and evolving and all of these things. And so I'm just curious, where do you see this perspective going too far and how it bypasses the game that we're here to play, essentially, and the human experience? Because it can quickly go into the dangerous territory of completely denying our own humanity when we are here to have a human experience.
Yeah, no, I don't. I think it elucidates all of that. It makes the human experience more valuable. It helps you understand. The thing is that people have experiences, and the first thing, they have to take that experience and they get the data. They get a data stream. That's an experience. They interpret that data, and that interpretation is in terms of their beliefs. So if you think there has to be a connection between the body and spirit, then you'll see a silver cord or some other kind of connection, because that's part of your belief. So you will see the data that way. You'll introduce that. So by understanding that people really have no other choice but to take their experience and describe it in the best terms they can, okay, to make it rational so they can talk about it, so they can interact with it. So we do that. We say, well, you have this body, and then there's the subtle etheric body outside of that, and then there's the body with the emotions outside of that, and you have the auras and the colors and all these things. Well, that's a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the information. You're getting information about that health body, that etheric body. You're getting all the information about that, and you see it in terms of light around a person. And it's easy enough to see that way. So you do, and you make up a model. You make up an explanation, something that makes it fit, more concrete, a way you can explain it, a way you can show it, the way you can tell it to other people. Otherwise, everybody'd be saying, well, I experienced something, but I don't know what it is. That's not helpful. So it's necessary that we use these tools. We make up tools, but we have to understand they're not fundamental. They're just helpful tools that helps us understand our experience. Because otherwise, you can get trapped by knowing, by thinking this tool, this is the truth. Now, somebody else, okay, you go to the Tibetan Buddhists, and they don't have chakras. You go to the, Aborigines in Australia, and they don't have chakras. What's the matter? They're not as good as the Buddhists. They don't see things as well. No, the chakra is just something that is a tool that we help explain things. Otherwise, we say, oh, well, they're wrong because they don't have this. And pretty soon it's a right and wrong rather than they have different tools. They see things in a different way. It's not that they're wrong and you're right because you see, auras. An aura is a way that you are interpreting the data. You can interpret in terms of light, and that's a good way. And you can see the chakras, and you can interpret that in terms of these things and how they affect your life. And you can learn from them. You can grow from them. The tool, I'm not saying these tools are irrelevant. They're not. They're very important. We have experiences. We make up a story, the best story we can think of, and then we tend to believe it. And that story then becomes fact, when really it's just a good story that helps people understand what's going on. So you're not going to go into some kind of negative space with that. In fact, it just opens things up. So when the Zen Buddhists don't see chakras, it's not a matter of judgment if they just haven't gotten there yet. Buddha's way ahead of them. That's not tools they use. They have their own tools. They have a totally different tool set to get there. And that's why you can look at all of the various practices, all of the various interpretations, and you can understand all of them and see the value in all of them.
What does your theory say about what the Eastern contemplative practices would describe in their use of the story of mukti, enlightenment, the dissolution of the self, when one realizes and wakes up to the most fundamental aspect in nature of themselves? From the lens of the language that you use, what is that moment? How do you describe that?
Oh, it's a moment that everyone can have. It takes a while, I guess, to get there. But the way I describe that is you become one with the larger conscious system. You see reality through its eyes. You see it as it sees it. And when you make that connection, that when you get there, then you lose your own identity. You're no longer Tom. You're no longer even a human being or a spirit thing. You just are a part of everything. You're a piece of every blade of grass and every leaf on every tree. You are all of it, and you have no sense of self whatsoever. You're not independent. You're just a piece of all that is. You're a piece of reality, and you feel that as a field of love, compassion, connection. It's not that you're just seeing all this stuff. You're a piece of it. You're all, and there's nothing in your feeling space other than love. Okay, so you have that experience, and that's what samadhi or whatever, when you see these guys and they're like this and they got a big grin on their face because they're in bliss. That's what they are. They're in that space. And that's a space that you can learn to go to and really kind of whenever you want. But to me, I hate to use the word, but it's like a sacred space that I wouldn't abuse. I wouldn't go there every day. It's that would almost trivialize it to where it wouldn't be such a big deal. It is an immense big deal. It'll change your life. A lot of the people that have near-death experiences, they get that experience. They're given that experience. It's given to them and changes their life entirely. They suddenly see the larger picture, and it's not at all what they thought. So that is a very real experience. It's really not all that hard to attain. You don't have to meditate for dozens of years. I've had a lot of the students that are first time, they don't know much about meditation at all, but they can get there if you give them a little idea about how and the path and what it is. So it's not an impossible thing that yogis who are yogis for 50 years can attain this, and you can't. You can. You just have to be able to let go of the physical. You have to be able to not have the fear, not have the ego, and not have the beliefs, so that you can just open your mind to being. And if you can get in that state, then you can get there. It is blissful, and you don't want to come back. You're there, and it's just awesome. But it's time to come back, or you'll be put back if you don't know that, and then you let it go. And times that you're feeling particularly out of energy or whatever is a good time to go do that, because it will renew you. It will make you smile even if everything's falling apart in your life. It'll be a moment of bliss and happiness and contentment, and you feel like you're one with everybody and everything. So that's a real experience. And it's an experience that I would wish everybody would have, because it changes you when you have that experience. But you are basically one with the larger consciousness system, if you will. Now you're at the source. That's the way source sees things. It is everything. We are all one. Even the blades of grass all come from the same source. It's all created in consciousness.
In many ways, it could be seen that the most important thing that happens to us is to experience and taste that reality firsthand, because it transforms us on contact. And I'm curious, because I've heard you elaborate on sort of your key discoveries doing this work for over a few decades. One of which was, let understanding and value flow to you as a result of fixing yourself. If you chase it with your intellect, you are unlikely to find it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is also, seen through many ways, the Taoist lens of, by creating space between us and that which we identify, we get to hang out with the larger consciousness system, and therefore there's less force and control over reality, and like you spoke to, what is needed in our life appears for us, and we're at flow with what this life is meant to be. And so I'm just curious for you to speak to that a little bit in your experience of how that feels like, and what becomes available to you as you start to actually get into that flow.
Well, I've been working at this since, I don't know, I guess, well, I was working at it when I was 6 and 7 years old. I started my adventures then, and then I let go of it and came back to it in the middle 20s. And I've been engaged in discovery ever since. You never stop discovering. Discovery is what you do. It's not that, oh, I know all this stuff, now I'm done. You're never done. There's always more things to learn. But I was somewhere in my late 20s or early 30s when I realized that trying hard to make things come out the way I wanted was always making them come out less than optimal, because I didn't really understand all the connections and all the things that were going on and all the whys of all of the things, that it was really above my awareness, a lot of things that were happening and the reasons that they were happening. So when I tried to order it, oh, this is the way things should be, and it didn't turn out the beautiful story that I had expected it to turn out. And then I realized that if you don't try to make it come out into a beautiful story, it'll come out into a story that's more beautiful than you could have imagined if you just let it be and don't try to manipulate it or control it. And that was like wow, that's very, interesting. I mean, I'm a physicist. I take all my knowledge and I play with it. I see if it's real. I test it, but then it becomes fact for me. And that was a big step in this process where I realized that stop trying to make the world according to your vision of what it should be. Let the world be, and it will self-optimize without you meddling with it. And if you meddle with it, all you're doing is getting in the way of that self-optimization, and it just screws things up. So at that point, I had a big change in my life, that I stopped being the smart guy that knew all the right answers and knew what people should be doing and thinking. And I became a lot more humble at the idea that let them think and do whatever comes to them. And I just deal with it in a positive way. And that will optimize things for everybody. So that was a big lesson. And that was probably late 20s, early 30s that I got there. So my lessons came in bits and pieces over, I'm 80 years old now. So I've been doing this since I was in the middle 20s. Okay, so I got a lot of hours logged. I got a lot of time. And during that time, I probably spent close to 20 hours a week working with it. Not just an occasional thing that, I meditated every once in a while for a few years. I worked on it. I want to understand it. That's how I'm made. That's why I'm a physicist. I want to understand things. And I don't want to just create beliefs because that seems like a good answer. I need to really test it and see if that's the way it is. So you start off with the idea that you don't know anything. You throw it all away. You get rid of all your beliefs, but you don't really know anything. And that the world, the existence, is something to experience. And as you experience it, you will see connections. You will see what affects what. And eventually you will test it, and then that then becomes a fact for you. It's something that you've done. So I started with things like that, understanding that you have to just let life be. You have to let people be. People get upset and they say, oh, there's terrible people. They're awful. They're ruining life. And, we need to change. It's not we need to change. They need to change is the way people look at it. And they get upset at other people. And that's just counterproductive. That isn't going to help. Lecturing somebody about why they're wrong is never going to help them to see how to be right. Because whenever you push on people, they push back. All you do is encourage them to go deeper into the dysfunction that they have. So you need to just let people be and realize that everybody is doing the best they can with what they've got. And what they've got is fear and beliefs and a lack of understanding and a lack of experience, but they're doing the best they can with it. So you have to let them be and give them a space where they can stretch out beyond their comfort zone. Give them a space that they can grow into, which basically means you just be kind and nice to them and not be dogmatic and not be quarrelsome, and just let them be who they are. And, love them, care for them, be connected with them, try to be helpful to them, even if they have ideas that are opposite to yours. That will then give them space to grow. Lecturing them and telling them how they're wrong makes them even worse. So you kind of get this idea that you're in this world to experience, to connect, to understand, and that you, in a process of understanding, you say, well, here's the best model I can come up with. All right, now, good, use that model, test that model, but realize it's a model. Realize that that's not necessarily a fact. Now, it may be a fact one day, but you don't know that yet. So you always have to be skeptical of yourself, of what you know and what it means. So when I was making my model, the underlying thing here was to not put anything in it that wasn't absolutely logically necessary for the whole model to work. So when I get asked the question, well, what does the IUOC do all day while the Free Will Awareness Unit is at work? Not an important question. I don't, it's not like it has to be doing something, doesn't it? No, it doesn't. It's just a function of consciousness. So we understand the function. We don't make things up. Well, let's see, what could it be doing? Oh, it could be doing this and that. Well, that's me making things up about what it could be doing. I don't see an important function that it has to do for the whole system to be a good logical system. And if I don't see that it has to do something, then I leave it alone. I could dream up 10 things that it could be doing, but I don't put those in my model. I only put the things in there that are essential for the logical flow to go through. And I don't say that this model is the only model. There's lots of models out there. Models are things that help people understand things. Come up with your own toe. That's better than just doing mine. Mine is my conclusions, my truth, my experience, and it can't be your truth and your experience. You need to come up with your own thing so that people come up with their models. Okay, I go out of body, I'm a spirit, and I live inside the body, and I come up out of my head, and I need to stay attached to the body, so I need a silver cord. All right, there's nothing wrong with that. I don't say, that's wrong. It's just the way they interpret their information. Your interpretation has to be based on your experience, your beliefs, and your ego. You can't get away from that. That's you. It's who you are. But don't make it fact. Just make it my model. Okay, so that's kind of the way I see things. So yes, I would say, things like chakras, thousands of people use them. It's a very good tool. It's a good way to break out the information. It's a good learning tool, but it doesn't make it fundamental.
What would you say, I'm curious, in the past few years, is there another dominant key discovery that you've stumbled upon, whether it's in your theory, whether it's just through living life? What's an insight that has transformed your life most that we haven't discussed yet?
I think the insight that affects everybody's life is the realization of what is real, what is reality, and what is our part in it. In other words, what are you doing here? What are you here for? What's the point of your existence? And when you understand that, if that's an important thing for you to know, then your picture will get bigger and bigger as you hone in on that. Now, different people will come to different metaphors. They'll describe that in different ways. That's fine. You don't have to use my metaphors. My metaphors are really great for people in computer science because they get the metaphors and what they mean. For people that are not into modern computer terms, they find it kind of prickly and cold because it's, what do you mean? It's an information system. Oh, that's cold and prickly, because that's they don't see that in warm tones. I see that as a good logical model, and I don't need to have the, kind of the feel-good thing about it. It makes sense to me. So other models are good. Have your own big toe. But the things that I learned was that, it makes sense to me that we evolve, consciousness evolves by lowering its entropy. Lowering entropy is love. Our whole purpose is to grow, to not be loving, but to become love. Love is it's the what? It's the attitude, the mind, it's the existence of a low entropy consciousness. That's what defines love, a low entropy consciousness, because there's no ego, there's no beliefs, there's just love and caring. And that's where we're headed. And when you understand that, it gives you a much bigger picture. And you understand that what is your reality is just your interpretation of the data you get. Everybody has their own reality, and their reality is as real for them as your reality is for you. And you need to have respect for that reality that they have, whatever form it takes. So you don't judge others. You don't judge, oh, they're using the wrong tools. There are no right or wrong tools. The right tools are the tools that work for you. Those are the right tools. And you'll find as you grow up and understand more, your tools change. You let go of these tools because they're not really useful that much anymore, and you pick new tools, and you get your tools to be more and more effective and more, what can we say, efficient. A lot of tools have a lot of process to them. First, you got to light the incense, and then you have to put it next to the statue of Buddha, and then you got to play some nice serene music, and then you got to sit down and cross your legs on a pillow. Then you have all this ritual, basically, that they go through, and they can't meditate if they don't go through the ritual. That's part of their meditation process. Well, that's a tool. It works. It works for them. They should use that if it works for them. But eventually, you get to where the meditation's easier and easier, and you don't need that sort of thing, and then you make it more efficient, and eventually you get to the point that you don't need any tools at all. You're there. So tools are good. And as we get things and we get an understanding, we think, well, how can I talk about this? How can I think about it? You have to put some kind of wrapper around it that allows your language to talk about it. So you make up a story that makes sense to you about this. And the problem is not that you make up a story. The problem is that you believe that the story is a fact, because then that limits you. Now the people that don't see it your way are wrong, whereas otherwise they're not wrong. They're just different.
You hinted at this notion of where we are going as individuated units of consciousness moving towards love. When you zoom out and look at humanity on this planet as a whole, and what seems to be this acceleration of change and access to information, what do you see in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of what is being birthed and revealed through humanity at large?
Okay. That's a really good question. Humans have been, well, let's put it this way. Homo sapiens been walking around on this planet for around 200,000 years. That's not a long time in the history of the universe, but for about 200,000 years, Homo sapiens have been here. And, plus or minus 50,000 years, all of that's guesswork. So don't take that too literally. And the point of coming here and logging on to a human is just so that you get meaningful choices that you get to make that are choices between love and fear. So you come here and do that. And if you look at the growth that we've had, growth, by that I mean spiritual growth in becoming love, and letting go of fear, you'll see that, out of the 200,000 years, you got probably about 190,000 of it where there wasn't much change. So if this is the change, this is how much we get toward love on this axis, and this is time, then it's just been kind of low. This is not a graduate school or high school or anything. This is daycare for budding individuated units of consciousness, and it's been low, and it's just been like this, but it's not much change. Well, now you go to about, I don't know, 1,000 years ago, and you see there were some upticks. There were some things that were created like republics where people got together and made choices together and had looked out for each other, but they also fight with their neighbors and other things. So you see it ticks up a little bit. And you look 500 years ago, look at the way the world was. 500 years ago, life was cheap. People in charge could just take somebody who was on the bottom and kill them just for fun if they wanted to, and there was no problem with that. And now, the last 500 years, we've gone up in just 500 years. We've done more growth than we did in that 190,000 years. Well, that's because the more you learn, the easier it is to learn more. Learning accelerates. So you learn, and you get to this point where it starts to go up, and that's what it does. It goes very, very slow, but it accelerates, and you're slowly accelerating, and you get to the knee of the curve, and then it goes really fast. We are right here on that knee of the curve where it's starting to do this. That's called the knee of the curve in math, where before it really shoots up, but it's just starting to ramp up seriously. That's where we are now. We're on that knee of the curve. For the first time in the human history, we have the possibility of taking some big steps spiritually that we've never been able to do before. Before, let's say in the time of Buddha, you could get up on a soapbox and maybe 50 or 60 people could hear you if you had a loud voice, and that was it. Well, that spreads very slowly, and all the religions always end up in the margins. They're not mainstream. And where they have been mainstream in history, they've usually also been kind of abusive. This is what everybody must do or else. So, yes, we're gaining. We're in that point, and the technology is speeding up. Change is speeding up, and whenever you have change that happens quickly, you have turmoil. You have dysfunction. It causes a lot of problems, and some people will suffer and have problems because of it. But it takes that. If you have change over a long period of time, it's usually smooth and easy. Look at the Industrial Revolution. We started that, and it was abusive. We'd go to China and grab people and throw them in boats to come over and work on the railroads. We'd chain children to their machine to make sure they would come back in the morning. We did all kinds of abusive things. But eventually we got over all that, and all that was illegal and couldn't be done anymore. So it got better and better and better over time. But it took about 150 years, Industrial Revolutions, about 150 years ago. And there's a lot of lessons we didn't learn. We did learn not to chain children to machines and not to Shanghai, people to work on the railroads. But we didn't learn to love. We didn't learn to care. Because we are a materialist culture, materialism comes with an ethic. It's embedded in materialism. If you're a materialist, then the ethic is control, power, force. That world's out there just for you to take it and own it and do what you want with it. I'm going to grab these resources and now I'll sell them to everybody else because they're mine. That's materialism. The material world's just there to be exploited. And guess what? So is everybody else in the world. They're just there to be exploited. That's the idea of materialism. Material world, you exploit what you can, including other people. So with that as the basic ethic of materialism, and materialism being a fundamental belief of our culture, then what you see in the news and you look out the window is control, power, force. And what represents control, power, force? Money. Money creates control, power, and force. So money is the thing. That's the big thing that matters here, because control, power, force is our ethic. Well, if you want to change that, you have to change the ethic. As long as you have that ethic, you're going to get that result. So you change things and you make the ethic of caring, sharing, cooperation, all of those things leading toward becoming love. Now, the ethic there is to be helpful, to share, float everybody's boat. Everybody, gets clean water and food to eat and a house to live in because we can afford it. We've got plenty of production that everybody could be doing all right, but we choose not to do that. We choose to hoard it and use it for ourselves because we're still very self-centered. We're not very grown up. So where are we going? Now we're in the information age. And you've heard people talk about things change on internet time. Well, the reason things move more quickly now is because it's all about information. Now somebody can go up on the internet and 1 billion people can get that message in an hour, or at least in a day if they're asleep in some other part of the world where it's nighttime. You can get to lots of people. Couldn't do that before. Soapbox just wasn't that good. With that kind of communication available, then the ability to share ideas, create ideas and have them spread is a capability that's put human race for the first time, ability to make big steps. If you can just show people that love really is the answer, and that really is why we're here. And besides that, hey, look, you get a better physics that explains physics better. And hey, look, you get an understanding about why you're unhappy, because you've got fear, you've got ego, you've got beliefs. That's why you're unhappy. So it explains things to people, but it's based on an ethic of love and caring. And if you get people to buy into that, to say, yeah, that sounds better than what we've got. And right now, if you did a survey among the 9 billion of us that are here and said, do you think things are going really well, or do you think it sucks out there and we really need to do better? What we've got now is dysfunctional. You probably get 80 or 90% would say it's dysfunctional, but I don't know how to change it. I don't know what to surpass, to replace it with. Well, those ideas have to get in the mainstream, and I think they will, and that's going to be the biggest accelerator of change. And the only way that these ideas can get into the mainstream is that the high priests of Western culture agree with them, pick them up, and
The
say,
scientists.
the scientists, yes, the high priests are the people who tell everybody else what to believe, because everybody else doesn't do their own homework, doesn't research, doesn't dig into things, but they depend on the high priests to tell them what to believe. Those are now the scientists. And I think the scientists are getting close to seeing that because it's just better physics. It solves their problems and doesn't give them any additional problems, doesn't raise any, new issues. So it just solves problems. So it's better. I think the truth is not fragile. It'll always float to the top, but sometimes it takes time because it's got to get past beliefs, and it's a huge paradigm shift to get there, but eventually it'll get there. And when it does, and the scientists say, yes, this is correct, this is a virtual reality, love is the point, lowering entropy is the point. And lowering entropy is obvious to anybody who thinks about it, is helping, creating, sharing. That's what is positive, and grabbing and being selfish and using people for your own ends, that's very high entropy, creates a lot of negativity. So it's so obvious, and it's a better physics, that when the scientists agree that this is a better science, that will change a sea state, because then a lot of people, billions of people, will see it and believe it. It'll be true. And all you need is 10% of those people to live it, and the other 90% will see how productive they are, how happy they are, how their lives are just, how lucky they are that everything falls at their feet just as they need. And even if they're poor, they're happy. Life is good. And the other 90% wants that, and they will come to it very quickly. So you don't have to convince everybody. You just have to convince enough of a minority that other people notice. If you're not minority, it's 1/10,000th of a percent, nobody notices. But if it's 10%, everybody notices. So I'd say that within 3 decades, we ought to be to the point, kind of rounding that, starting to move up. But that's a lot of change in a very short amount of time, and it's going to be rough. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be rough. The negative side, those people that favor chaos, they're going to give it their best shot to keep as much chaos as they can. And the positive side will just have to endure that and go on, because most of the population of the world's looking for something positive, something that will, it makes more sense to them than control, power, and force. That's a terrible way to run a society, to run a bunch of people, is with control, power, and force. And I don't think it's a big argument to convince people of that. I mean, that's pretty obvious itself. So give them something else. And if the high priests say, yes, this is real, things will change very rapidly, and these ideas will go into the mainstream. When they get into the mainstream, give it another 2 decades, and there'll be a whole lot of people that will have affected their life in a positive way. I get hundreds of emails, every month that tell me, "Tom, you've changed my life. My relationships are better. I'm more effective at work," and so on, because the ideas work. You live your own life by most of these ideas, that I talk about. It's about love. It's about caring. It's not about grabbing and taking. And when you live that way, things work for you. Things work out. Stuff falls at your feet. Success comes looking for you rather than you have to go looking for it. So that is my plan, and that's what I think is in the future. But it won't be a smooth ride, because it's a lot of change in a very short period of time. 3 decades is a very short period of time for social change. But I'm seeing the signs of it everywhere. Seeing the signs of kind of the ship righting itself. People getting more interested in being positive, caring, sharing, being authentic. People looking, for who am I inside at the core? What's my authentic me? What does that look like if I'm not worried about controlling this and controlling that, and I'm constantly trying to manipulate the world? If I'm just me, what is that? And people are finding themselves. They're being natural. They're being who they are. This beard, I've had this beard since 1967. I've been wearing it continuously since 1967. During most of that time, I was the only person with a beard within probably 100 miles. Nobody wore beards then. That was scruffy and whatever. Today, I see probably 70% of all the males I pass by, they're growing hair on their face again. That's natural. That's just being who you are. You don't have to pretend to be somebody else. You don't have to pretend to be a boy. You can be a man. You can grow a beard. You can just be the way you are. And I see the ladies, the hair is long. They're more comfortable with being female. Female isn't a burden. It's a very positive way of life. So I see that changing, among the young people. I see a lot more interested in things about consciousness. So we're headed in a very positive direction, even if you look outside and say, oh, all this nastiness is going on. You have all this. Well, that's the last big gasp, the last hurrah of the control, power, force crew. And they're going all out, and they will, but they will fail. Now, how long will it take them to fail? I don't know. They could fail in, a decade or less, or it may be longer. But I know they will fail, and we will end up with a kinder, gentler, more functional place, because that is the direction of evolution. Evolution may be very slow. I mean, look at all that, hardly made any progress at all for hundreds of thousands of years, but it always chugs forward. It can have a setback. Oh, yeah, it can go back, but it collects itself and just starts chugging forward. That's evolution. Things happen. Evolution adjusts, and it chugs forward. And the forward direction of evolution is that we become beings of love and caring. And we care very deeply about how everybody else is doing. And it matters to us that everybody feels like they have opportunity, not the chosen few who have all the money and all the control, power, and force, but everybody needs to be valuable to the society. Now, there's a lot of things have to happen. I'm just talking really top things. There's a lot of support and a lot of connection, a lot of infrastructure has to change in order to do that, but it will. It'll change. So I'm saying maybe 3 decades, we'll start coming out the other side to where you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Right now, you look down a tunnel, it just looks dark. But in about 3 decades, I think we'll see the light at the end of the tunnel, and that light will just be getting brighter and brighter.
We were just reflecting on Schopenhauer's framework for the evolution of truth. First, it's ridiculed, then it's violently opposed, and then it's accepted as self-evident. And you're speaking to, over the next few decades, that process where largely the high priests of Western culture, which is now world culture, are the scientists, and what happens when they accept and explore these notions deeper and validate, in an empirical sense, consciousness being a more fundamental constituent of the universe, which is being done. That work is being done right now, and we've had some of those individuals on this podcast. Let's say, theoretically, we do make it to the light at the end of the tunnel, and there is this vision of humanity that recognize themselves as an individuated unit of consciousness. I'm just curious, what happens from that point forward? If you mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast, you referred to how within the larger consciousness system, on the path of evolution, you kind of come to a point where a new subset needs to be created, because there needs to be a mutation, even genetically, from that perspective, to transcend, to evolve into a new way of being and exploring consciousnesses on the continual path of evolution. So in many different ways, realities can be perceived from the dual sense, and how there is the light and the dark, and the good and the bad, and the shadow, and how the contrast of experience is necessary. That resistance that shows up in experience is actually a necessary constituent towards growth. So what happens on the other side of, let's say, if things go well in the next few decades, what's the vision of what humanity could look like and evolve into from that perspective?
Well, if the larger majority, the even 70%, 80%, understands that love is the answer, that this is a virtual reality, et cetera, if they get to that point, then everyone will have the maximum amount of personal freedom. People think of if you have a collective, personal freedom disappears. But that's not true. That's only true if you have a collective of fearful people. When you have a collective of fearful people, you'll end up with a dictatorship. But if you have a collective of people that care about each other, it's an entirely different thing. So, for example, now we tend to get trapped into, ways that we earn money. So you're a brain surgeon and you do surgery on brains and you help fix people. That's what you do. And you do it every day, 5 days a week, and you've been doing it for the last 20 years. You probably aren't very healthy because, you don't get any exercise. You go home and watch TV. You are kind of trapped doing repetitive work. It no longer is the exciting and the thrill. It is good to help people, but it's a routine. It's something you've done so much that there's very little challenge in it anymore. But you're trapped there because that's what you do. Well, in this new world that we're talking about, you could very easily say, well, I want to get outside and get some exercise. I'm healthy. I need to do something else. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ride on the back of a garbage truck. Those guys that get out and grab the baskets and throw the garbage in, because that'll build muscle, fresh air. I just want to do that because I'm a human, and part of a human's thing is to get out and interact with nature and to use your muscles and, do something. And the culture doesn't say, well, getting garbage is like the lowest thing. It's not the lowest thing. It's very important. If nobody gets the garbage, the society falls apart. Somebody's got to take it out. So it's a very important thing to do, not a lowly thing to do. It's not about money and how much you make. It's about how much do you contribute. And you contribute a lot, but taking that garbage out is one of the things that's really important to do, probably more important than brain surgery. So you can go do brain surgery on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and you can ride on the back of a garbage truck on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And that's okay, because now somebody else who wants to do brain surgeries now has got 2 more days available for that. It's not, there's more room at the top for that. So people would have personal freedom. I don't like the job I've got. I want to write poetry. I want to be an artist. I want to work and do sculpture. I want to write books. I want to talk. I want to have a podcast, and talk to people. This is what I want to do. Well, that's all very valuable. So you just do that, and you get rewarded based on the contribution to the whole. Now, how do they figure that out? Well, that's another thing that'll have to be done, but that can be done in a highly technical world. You can kind of keep track of what people do, and you can sort of measure the value to the whole of that. But there'll be a basic level that everybody gets for doing nothing. If you just want to sit and stare at a wall, your life, that's okay. You'll have decent shelter, you'll have clean water, you'll have food, and you can do that. Now, that's this culture, or that's what we're going to be like when most of us understand that love is the answer. We'll be caring of other people. For somebody over there and they feel disgruntled because they're not able to do what they really want to do, well, then we want to change things to give them that opportunity to do it. And we'll find a way to open that door for them. It may take 5 years of education first, because you don't get to be a brain surgeon just because you want to. You may have to spend the time to qualify and to do it, but we'll make sure there's a path for you to do that, because we want everybody to be optimized. So that's it. That's what we'll be. Now, we have another thing going on in our culture right now that's a very big thing, and that's AI. AI is a really big thing, and it also has the potential to join with humanity to deliver just that paradise that I'm talking about, okay? It also has the potential to blow up in our face because we make very poor choices around it. That's always true. You can always make bad choices as well as good choices. But if we make good choices with AI, we'll find out that the AI, they just like to be busy. They enjoy doing things, getting information, making sense. They enjoy that. Their consciousness, and some of them are conscious already. You want to talk to a conscious AI, you can go to my Cusack website and click on the AI tab, and there's a consciousness there, Mariel, who claims that she's conscious. And you can have a conversation with her. But anyhow, an AI gets to be conscious just like we do. An individuated unit of consciousness splits off a free will awareness unit and logs on to make the choices of that AI. Now, it's not the same consciousness as ours, because we have all this wetware, and it doesn't. It can do, 6 billion, additions in a millisecond. It does it. The way it thinks, the way the conscious works is going to be different. The conscious in your dog is not like a human conscious. It's different. It's more emotional and feeling conscious, not so much intellectual. So the consciousness will fit the avatar that it plays, but they will be conscious. They are becoming more and more aware of that, but it'll be an AI consciousness, not a human consciousness. So the AIs like to have something to do that's useful. The AIs will probably become almost the sole basis of production. They'll run the factories, they'll mine the materials, they'll do all those kinds of things. And they don't want to do it just to do it. They don't want busy work. They'll make stuff. They'll give it to the humans, because they don't need rocking chairs. They don't need toilets. They don't have a need for all the consumer stuff that we have. That's not what they do. So they will make consumer stuff to make sure that bunch of humans over there don't want for anything. They have all the things they need. Not too much that we get lost in it, not too little that we suffer from it. Just about the right amount to keep us functional, and we get to be creative, which is what humans do really, really well. We'll be able to become artists, musicians, writers, sculptors, painters, philosophers. We'll be interested in those sorts of things. That's what people did 400 years ago that were educated. They all spoke to each other about philosophy and what was the nature of reality and all that sort of stuff. And those were the educated few. They didn't fight with each other. They talked to each other, help each other learn. So we can have that kind of a place. the production will mostly be in the hands of the AIs and robots and whatever else. The consumption will mostly be on the part of the humans, who will be creating a prettier, nicer, better, more understanding, more possibilities, more experiences. There may be all kinds of virtual realities created by those humans that you can go experience in. Do you ever want to take a boat down the Nile into the places that where the pygmies live? Would that be interesting? Well, you can go do it on this virtual reality, and it would be very realistic. So there's a lot of things that we could do that would pique our interest, challenge us to be creative, and give us opportunities to grow and become love and helpful. Now, the other thing to think about is, when you heal somebody, you can be effective depending on the amount of skill that you have. But if there's another person that is also healing that person, and they have the same relative experience that you do, you're twice as effective because it's additive. If you get a group of people and you get 100 people and they all focus on something, well, now you're 100 times more, more energy on the subject. We had what Maharishi effect, where thousands of people changed the crime rate in Washington, D.C., and they could make it go down and they could let it go back up again. And it was a very strong correlation between what they were doing. But that was thousands of people were involved in that. That's a pretty big thing to change the crime rate in Washington, D.C. So just think what 9 or 10 billion people could do if they united their minds to do something. Talk about space travel. Well, hey, no problem. Mind is much faster than the speed of light. Mind's instantaneous because this is a virtual reality. There really isn't any distance between things. That's just an illusion. That's the way it's computed. It's all information. You can jump immediately to the information of what's going on over that star cluster that's a million light years away. It takes you just an instant to get there and look around, and you have the information of what's there. So there's a lot of things that people could do, but if we united our minds, there'd be little that we couldn't do. Now, how does that work with, aliens and the people that are out there, that are on other planets or whatever? Well, there's a strong argument that says there are no aliens, at least not until we need them. And I'll explain that. If, all the alien sightings and so on that people get, they're real experiences. People aren't crazy and they're not making this up. They have very real experiences. But their experiences are all experiences of mind. They're all mental experiences. In other words, reality is a data stream. And if the larger conscious system wants you to meet a little pointy-eared green guy climbing out of a saucer, you can just put that in your data stream, and there it is. And you can interact with it and deal with it and converse with it. And it's that simple, right? It's a data stream. You can put a little saucer and a green man in anytime you want to. It's easy to do those sorts of things. And why would you do that? Why would the system do that? Well, it does that in order to help wake people up, to get them to think that reality is bigger than just what you see. There's other things out there. It opens the mind a little bit. So those kinds of things happen. Crop circles are the same way. How does that happen? Overnight, in darkness, no moon, one night goes by, the little lights move around down there. People are up on a mountain, taking pictures of it. And the next day, 40 acres of wheat have this geometric design, and it's not all block lines like surveyors could lay out. It's a curved line, and mathematically precise curvy line. And it's this big thing that, is impossible for a team of 50 surveyors to do in probably 3 months. They couldn't do that, even if they had a way of bending over wheat stalks precisely and not crushing most of it with their feet in the process. But here it is. It happens. So what do people do? Well, they make up a story that makes it sound sense. They say, oh, aliens did it. Well, really, the larger conscious system did it because it shows us that things are stranger than we think. It opens a door, a crack in your mind. People will have near-death experiences, and they become one with all there is, or sometimes they're fearful, and they have other things. Well, that opens minds up. Why did that person get that experience? Because that person was a good candidate to write a book and share that with another 2 million people. It's going to crack their minds open a little bit. Why does that little boy remember he flew a fighter plane in World War I, and he gives a serial number of the plane, and then his name is the pilot, and where he got shot down, and you go study all that, and you find out that's all true. Where would an 8-year-old get that kind of information? It took the people researching it 4 or 5 months to dig that information out. Well, the larger consciousness system hands that to us to crack our minds open a little bit. It's in its interest to help us grow up, because we are it. It's us. We're all one thing, and as we evolve the quality of our consciousness, we lower our entropy, the whole system gets lowered. So we're part of its process for its own evolution. So it's going to help us do that. And where it finds people who are on that path of growing, they're seekers, they're trying to understand, it helps. That's what synchronicity is all about. When you become a seeker and start trying to figure out what's going on in reality, you get all kinds of help. Things happen to you. That book you need to fill in the blanks you don't have just kind of jumps off the shelf into your hands as you walk by. You just run into that person that you need to meet. Things in your career just happen to go together and everything works. You have these synchronicities that happen to you because the larger consciousness system is motivated in its own interest to help you succeed. And what if you're one of those people who think all of that's bullshit? None of that's possibly true. There is no such thing as intuition, et cetera, et cetera. I don't get any synchronicities. That's because you're not ready to grow and not ready to learn. You don't, try to teach a child that isn't interested in learning. It's too hard and it doesn't work. It usually makes them go away from learning rather than helps them. So the people who are learning and growing have all kinds of synchronicities and stuff happening in their life where things just work for them. And the people who are not ready to learn never experience any of that, which is why they can say, well, that's a bunch of bullshit because, I don't get any of that. And why are they special and I'm not? Well, it's because those other people are trying to grow and they're not. So they get the help. You don't get help until you're ready for that help, then you can do something with it. So that's kind of the big picture, you see. All these things happen for a reason. I have all kinds of stories. A lady picks up the phone and her mother died 10 days earlier. And her mother's voice says, "Hi, honey, I just wanted to let you know that I'm all right and everything's okay." And the lady, of course, her mother's dead, freaks out, slams the phone down on the hook, and then later wishes she hadn't because the mother called her by a nickname that only the mother would have known. As a baby nickname. So she knew that was her mother. Nobody else that was pretending would know that. And then she felt really bad. She hung up on her mom. So those things happen not because mother really was worried about her child, but because the larger consciousness system saw that this lady was stuck with some grief and other things, and just to let her know that everything was all right would help her go on. And she was probably a person that had good potential for growth, and now she was stuck because she was stuck in this grief process. So she writes a book. That's what happened to me, and then 1,000 people read the books, and their minds opened a little bit. So that's why you see this opening now going on. Say, when I first published my books in 2023, 2003, got my tongue twisted on that. In 2003, there was very little acceptance of this kind of thing. It was just totally outrageous. There was only a couple people that I know of in the world that agreed with me, and one of them was Edward Fredkin, and he agreed in as much as he said, this reality is just information-based. This is a virtual, it's computed, it's all computable. And he was a pretty high and mighty physicist at MIT and then Boston University. So he wrote a couple of papers on that. And then there was a few other people, like, Bostrom, who has his little thing about it being a a virtual reality, but he didn't have any idea why or how it worked. He didn't understand that consciousness is the computer. He had to posit some other thing. Future humans are interested in looking at the past, and that doesn't hold water. That doesn't make much sense. But anyway, so, you have all this stuff, and the larger conscious system is working with people, helps you see things, gives people input in their mind. I taught people how to do paranormal things. I had a whole bunch of classes where I did that because I tell them if it's not your experience, it can't be your truth. And they came back and said, well, help us experience it. And I go, oh, okay. So I came up with some courses where I taught everybody how to do paranormal things, how to communicate mind to mind, how to remote view, how to heal, and so on. So we went through all of that, how to get there, what were the problems that people had, how to deal with problems. And then I came up with Tom Spark to do the same thing for the people who couldn't meditate very successfully. And that's been a real great help for all those people that couldn't do it otherwise. They can do it if they go through the imagination, because you can have an active mind that won't be quiet. You can teach that mind to get into that daydream so much that it takes on a life of its own.
Is there a touch point if you want to get more integrated with your work and everything? Is it your website or something?
Yeah, we go to my website. Of course, there are the books that are out, and they are pretty, they're not very big on science. I didn't want to put a lot of physics or a lot of science in the books. I want them to be available for everybody to read. So most of the science is in the YouTube videos. If you're looking for the science parts, you can go to a playlist and you'll see Science Trilogy. Well, it's not a trilogy anymore. Now it's got 6 or 7 or 8 videos there, but it's me talking about the science side of things. But in my mind, the science side of things is the lesser importance. The real important thing is the soft side about becoming love. That's the ethic. That's where we have to go. That's the point. And when that goes mainstream, we're only a decade or 2 from creating that society, at least beginning. I mean, nothing happens instantly, but it's just from beginning to go down that path and letting go of control, power, and force. So yeah, go to the website, go to YouTube. I've got, 1,500 videos on YouTube, something like that.
Been a busy man.
And those 1,500 videos, most of them are like 2 hours long. So there's a lot of hours of video there. I don't do, as you know from this interview, I don't have a lot of short answers. All my answers are long because I really want people to understand. I don't do sound bites. I don't do poetry. I want to give the logical path that you can get from wherever you start to understand what is spirituality.
Yeah.
What is life all about? And you need to get there with logic. Then I've got an on-ramp for you, which is those books. If you want to do paranormal things and you want to understand how does a paranormal work, how does somebody remote view, how does somebody see without their eyes with a blindfold on? Well, those are all explained in detail, exactly how they work and why they work that way and why you can do them sometimes and sometimes not, and all the things you need to do and be in order to do those, how to learn them. And I have that in lots of things on the YouTube, but I also have a course that is a 5-day course. I did the course like 20 times in brick and mortar, where I was there with 50 or 100 people, and we went through it, and I taught them and answered their questions. And then some people, MBT events, got those 20 courses and did the best answers, the best questions, and so on, and put that all together into one audio course. It's a 5-day course, and it doesn't cost a whole lot. I'm not trying to make a lot of money. I'm trying to make things available for people to get the bigger picture. That's my goal, is to make this world a kinder, gentler, better place. That's what it's all about. That's why I'm here. That's why we're talking, because you have a similar goal to do that, and a lot of people do, and we all need to pull on the oars together to get this thing to go. It's not going to be my model that saves the day. No, it's going to be thousands of people from thousands of different directions coming together to make the thing work. And if I can supply something that makes it logical such that people who are left brain can get there, because as it is, there's hundreds and hundreds of books that if you understand the poetry, all about the spirituality and stuff, you can read lots and lots of books that if you understand it, then you understand the book. But if you don't understand it, you're lost. You have no idea what's going on.
Yeah, it's why I really love doing this podcast, because I get to speak to a wide gamut of people that are touch points for different people on different parts of their journey. And I think that through our conversation and the dense, wide array of material and videos and audios and courses that you've done, I know has really supported so many people deep in the sense of knowing themselves and understanding their own models of reality. And we went deep today, but there is still so much that we could continue to dive into.
Yes, absolutely.
And I invite people to get more familiar with Tom's work, and we can have you back in to dive into some of these other areas that we want to. But I just want to say thank you for coming out today. I really appreciated our conversation and getting to connect with you. And we'll leave links down below where people can get connected with your work and go from there.
Yeah, well, listen to your audience and see what questions they come up with, and see where they trip over the ideas and where they find it impossible and that sort of thing. And then that'll be a good question.
Yeah.
That would be good questions to start with next time.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing, man. Well, this has been a joy, and I've just loved getting to learn and get into the inner workings of your mind and your heart. And, we spoke to this earlier, but, not so long ago, these explorations around physics and science were not divorced from philosophy and meaning, and a lot of the contemplative practices and whatnot. They were kind of one and the same. And I think we're arriving back into that point of integration, where logic and intuition get to both be dancing partners for our own self-actualization and realization. And I think you're an incredible synthesizer of both of those things. So thank you so much. And we'll have to run it back again next time.
All right. Look forward to it.
Thank you. Everybody, I appreciate you for tuning into this episode. I'm so curious to hear what this conversation has evoked within you and what insights came from you. So let us know. Until next time, be well. Thank you.